past decade, 160 million World of Tanks players have been finding victory in 160 million different ways. Like the 3.7 million players who pulled off the impossible to get an achievement rarer than being hit by lightning. Or the 2.9 million players who never rolled the same tank out of their garage twice. Variety is the spice of life. After 10 years, our players are still discovering new paths to victory every day. Join our Brotherhood of Champions to find yours. Play now on PC. For the past decade, 160 million World of Tanks players have been finding victory in 160 million different ways. Like the 3.7 million players who pulled off the impossible to get an achievement rarer than being hit by lightning. Or the 2.9 million players who never rolled the same tank out of their garage twice. Variety is the spice of life. After 10 years, our players are still discovering new paths to victory every day. Join our Brotherhood of Champions to find yours. Play now on PC.
Hello and welcome to Tankfest Online 2022. I'm Richard Cutland from World of Tanks and former tank commander for the best armoured regiment in the world, of course, the Royal Tank Regiment.
And I'm Richard Smith. I'm the director of the Tank Museum here in Bovington in the south of England. And the Tank Museum is really the home of the tank. We've got everything here from the very first tank ever all the way through to vehicles which are in service around the world at the moment. And you are lucky enough that you have tuned in to Tankfest 2022, and Tankfest is the day where we roll out the historic fleet for the world to see, and you can come and see the world's best and most impressive display of historic moving vehicles. And it's also for us here at the Tank Museum, where we're a registered charity, and Tank Museum is our biggest fundraising event of the year, where we generate the income that gives us the chance to keep these historic vehicles running for everybody's benefit in the future. So during the course of today's stream, if you want to support the Tank Museum's work, then feel free to help support us on Tiltify. You can support us on Patreon. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. And of course, if you want to get some goodies, you can buy things from our online shop.
And also, don't forget, of course, for you watching on Twitch, to ensure that you've got your Twitch drops enabled, because there are some chances to win some fantastic goodies, such as a Type 59 Gold and a whole lot more. As far as the rundown's concerned, so settle in for the next 3 hours with myself and Richard. We're doing various things and bringing you various excitement things to Tankfest this year. We've got the live vehicle displays. Now, of course, me and Richard were saying we are live here, as you can see, with the Q8 arena in the background at the moment. So we're hoping, A, that everything runs as to plan as far as the vehicles are concerned, and of course that the weather holds out for us as well. So we've got vehicle displays. We'll be dipping in and out and showing you the best of the arena displays. We've got videos from museums around the world again. And we're also going to get a chance to see me. A couple of weeks ago, the museum were kind enough and generous enough to let me loose on 3 Cold War icons. So more about that later on.
But first, let's explore the Tank Museum site. And earlier today, Richard was exploring the Tank Museum and the Tankfest arena, and he was having a look at the Tank Museum's, the Tankfest Living History area.
Away from the arena are the living history encampments, and they're particularly popular with the visitors, where you can get a chance to actually look at the uniforms and the equipment that made up these incredible reenactment groups. And I'm joined today by Nick Wilson from the 29th Infantry Group. I hope I've got that right, Nick.
Infantry Division, Richard, but
I was
yeah,
close,
you're close,
wasn't I? So, Nick, the whole idea here, for you, firstly, my first question would be, why the 29th Infantry Division Group?
So 29th Infantry for us was a very easy decision. We are a group of guys that are mostly based in Bournemouth and Poole. The 29th Infantry and our colleagues in the 1st Infantry Division did all their training for D-Day in Dorset, Devon and Cornwall. So it's very close to the populace and close to the hearts of the people here. We get to talk to a lot of the veterans, but equally on the home front, people that actually remember the Americans arriving, what it was like and how it changed their villages, and then more importantly, the absolute silence when they suddenly disappeared one night, never to be seen again.
So how did you personally get into reenacting in the first place then?
Well, I was always into toy soldiers and models as a child. It was a natural progression. I did army training back in the day. But yeah, for me, it was about keeping the history of something as magnificent as this huge event, mobilizing for the Normandy invasion. So yeah, fantastic. And again, as I say, to be local team, it was just amazing.
Can you take us,
yeah, of course,
a quick brief tour through the encampment?
So what you see today is a sort of cut down version of a battalion CP. We have our mess facility here. You can see them starting to prepare for dinner now. The mess hall where the guys are currently cleaning weapons, and then over to your left here is effectively a recreation of what would a battalion CP would look like.
And how important to you is accuracy for all of this?
Oh, it's massive. For us, it's all about getting the authenticity right, because the world really wants to understand what it was like to see this equipment. We don't want to sort of lead them astray in terms of sort of getting modern stuff. This is all authentic equipment.
And I'd imagine probably most of the questions you get from the general public are about the arms.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Richard. Yeah, everybody's interested in the guns. We live in a PC gaming world where they've all seen them on all sorts of games. But the reality is most people have never got to see them up close and personal. We give them the opportunity to see these things in the flesh, and they get to touch them. We're very liberal about how we actually, under supervision, of course, but yeah, so they actually get to experience the weapons firsthand for which is unique.
We can see a few around here. I mean, what would you say, I mean, perhaps the most interesting or the most asked about, most discussed?
Well, obviously the guns are very important. Everybody wants to see the Thompsons and the Garans and the carbines, but this Bangalore torpedo always starts a conversation because it's one of those rare bits of equipment where people have heard about it, they've seen it on Private Ryan, nobody really understands the concept behind it and how it came to be and what it was for. And basically this is a beach obstacle defence clearing, so you work through clearing the barbed wire. It came up at short notice. It's basically a big steel pipe full of TNT. You screw them together, you put a deck cord up the far end, you light it, it's very robust, bang, it's very agricultural, clears the defences, and then the troops could go through that breach defence.
I was going to ask, what's on the menu?
It's always a secret, but I've been led to believe that it's going to be something very pleasant.
And if anybody is interested in getting into reenacting themselves, what's the best process that they can go through?
So there's all sorts of routes into us. We have a website. Most of us have got business cards. We'll always welcome the conversations that we have with the public. We're always inviting new members into the team. We're one big community.
Brilliant. Nick, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything you do, keeping history alive.
Thanks very much, Richard.
You're watching Tankfest live from the Tank Museum here in Bovington in the south of England. That was a segment about our reenactors here at Tankfest, a really important part of the show here every year. Richard, what was it that particularly caught your eye in the reenactors area this year?
Do you know, for me, it's always about them year on year, is the attention to detail is absolutely fantastic.
Extraordinary.
I asked a bit there about the mess hall that they'd set up in there. They would even try and recreate some of the menus that they would have back in the day. So quite incredible, really.
The commitment to authenticity is tremendous. And actually, when you come to Tankfest, they're tremendous at engaging with the public. They really want to explain what they're doing, where the equipment comes from, how it's used, in a way which most people never get a chance to see.
And I think, of course, it's dynamic the way they do it. It's not stale, the information. So as well as having the information themselves and talking about it, they can actually show you the information as well, which is great. It is fantastic.
Terrific. Now, we were talking with Richard a little while ago, and we discovered that it had been something like 30 years since he last drove a Chieftain tank. So we decided that we should put this right. And here is the first of our exclusive Tank Top Gear videos.
This is the mighty British Chieftain tank, a tank I'm very familiar with. Weighing 55 tonnes, it has a top speed of 28 miles per hour and a range of 310 miles. A Cold War creation, it was specifically designed to counter the threat posed by swarms of Soviet tanks that sat waiting across the East German border. Therefore, its design erred towards defensive usage, prioritising armour and firepower over manoeuvrability. It entered service in 1965, replacing the successful Centurion as Britain's first main battle tank, until the Challenger 1 was phased in during the 1980s. The low silhouette of Chieftain made it ideal for hold-down firing positions, where it would be hard to spot and hard to hit. The frontal armour was thick too, with a cleverly designed turret offering unrivaled protection for its time. But perhaps its best feature was its gun. The Royal Ordnance L11A5, 120mm of deadly firepower and accuracy. In fact, it was so good, it was used on Challenger 1. And it was whilst mounted on the Challenger 1 that this gun would scoop the record for the longest tank kill, when, in 1991, an Iraqi tank was knocked out from a range of over 3 miles. It's a record that still stands to this day. Inside, the crew of 4 enjoyed some protection from NBC attack, inside a pressurised crew compartment, whilst happily brewing tea using the famous boiling vessel. With all these impressive design features, some would say that the Chieftain tank was, in its time, the best tank in the world. And its crew would probably agree, as long as it broke down in a good firing position. The Achilles heel for the Chieftain can be found beneath the back decks, in the shape of the L60 multi-fuel engine. This was a nature requirement that only the Brits seemed to adhere to, and in short, turned out to be a massive overcomplication that compromised performance. And, as a result, tank crewmen like me found themselves spending far too much time on the tank part repairing them. But what's it like to drive? So here we are now, driver's cab of the Chieftain. I'm feeling super old as it was some 38 years ago that I trained to be a driver in this vehicle. Start up, I'm amazed I can actually remember the correct sequence to start up, i.e. GUE, up online, ensuring the green light's there to make sure it's charging, and then the main engine on. You'll notice the gun is clamped over the back decks at the moment. This is just because there's a fault in the gun control equipment. Driver's position, super comfy, many nights spent sleeping in here in the past. I'm fully opened up at the moment, but there is the ability to drop the seat, fully reclined position, close the hatch and then just rely on the driver's periscope to be able to see. Controls are straightforward. I'm changing gear with my left foot using the gearbox controller pedal, pulling off in second. There is 6 gears in total, but to be honest, looking at the size of this track, I think I'll be lucky to even get into 5th. Oops, gear changes, not the best there. My crew would not be particularly happy. I'm certainly out of practice. But the steering levers on this particular vehicle, it's good. The steering levers are good, responsive, and you know, it's Chieftain. It's about as smooth as you're going to get for a ride. I feel like I'm 18 again. Though much maligned for its reliability, I still have a lot of affection for the Chieftain. And besides all that, it was a genuinely ambitious concept that pushed the limits of technology. Sadly, the engine pushed them just a bit too far, and that's what prevented this tank from achieving the export success that its forerunner, the Centurion, did. That's why just 1,800 were built, half serving with the British Army, and the remainder sold to Kuwait, Jordan, Oman and Iran, who still operate them today.
Welcome back live at Tankfest 2022, where the Second World War looks like it's just kicked off again behind us here in the background. So you might hear a certain amount of gunfire, which is probably not aimed at us at all. But Richard, first time behind the tillers and the Chieftain in 30 years. How did it feel?
Yeah, to be fair, it was a few more than 30 years, Richard. I didn't want to give away my age there. It was fantastic. And I think for me, what was quite surprising was, I mean, your guys were great to start with, but getting in there and actually remembering the sequence, the startup procedure. So it was a wonderful experience. And obviously, I've got a lot of love and affection for Chieftain.
Was it one of those where you found your hands going to the right place, but you didn't know why?
Absolutely, and the only embarrassing thing was that, I mean, you clearly see on the video some of my gear changes. If there had been a gunner in there, he would not be happy at all.
A little bit ropey.
A little bit rusty, yes. As you can see there, of course, at the moment, you can hear, as Richard said, the bangs and the whirs. The Axis and Allied forces are squaring off to each other in there. I don't think there's any prizes for who's going to win.
To be honest, the Germans got a pretty bad track record at Tankfest. We always take the line, if the Germans want to win at Tankfest, they can organise their own event.
And also there, of course, don't forget there to have your Twitch. If you're watching on Twitch, have your Twitch drops enabled. And also don't forget the mega sale of World of Tanks. We've got 23 fantastic premium shop bundles with discounts up to 40%. So all the details are there and the links are in the description.
And don't forget as well, you can support the Tank Museum too. You can donate through Tiltify, or you can make a donation through the Super Chat, which sounds fantastic, on YouTube. Now we're going to move on from the battle here, and one of the things we normally have at Tankfest every year is we get guest vehicles from around the world as our fellow museums bring vehicles to show off. This year it's not been possible because of the travel restrictions that were involved in COVID recently, and we were unable to plan them in. However, we have been able to try and bring them in different ways.
So what we did was we actually asked all the museums, if, of course, these travel restrictions weren't in place, what is it from your museum that you would love to bring to Tankfest?
And our first guests are going to be our friends in the Arsenal Museum in Sweden, and they're going to show off what they've got.
Welcome to the land of weird designs. Here we are at the Swedish Tank Museum, and I will show you a vehicle that we would like to take to Tankfest. This is the Landsverk L30 Welcome Track vehicle from 1931, the only existing example in the world. And this is the result of an idea from many countries to find a solution on the problems they had with bad reliability and low speed on tracked vehicles. And this is designed that Landsverk, who was becoming a leading company in tank design during the 1920s, they came up with this idea with a combination of wheels and tracks. A fantastic vehicle. This prototype is the only one ever built. It has a crew of 3 to 4 and 14 millimeters of armor. It was supposed to be armed with a 37 millimeter or 47 millimeter main gun. It has a weight of 11.5 tons, and the engine at the rear is a Maybach V12 petrol engine, 8 liters and 150 horsepower. With the tracks, it had a pretty good cross-country performance at a speed of 35 kilometers an hour, and in only 20 seconds it could change from tracks to wheels, and with a top speed at 75 to 80 kilometers an hour, it could travel long distances at high speed. On the inside there is a driver at the front, and at the rear there is a rear driver's position for reversing the vehicle. How cool is that? But the driver's position is the result of a designer that got a bit carried away. It is as complicated as it can be, with 14 levers and pedals and 1 steering wheel. How cool would it be to take this vehicle to Tankfest and see it running? In our collection we have a lot of interesting and unique vehicles. If you would like to explore the collection, please have a look at our Facebook, YouTube and Instagram. See you out there.
A massive thank you to Stefan and his team there from the Swedish Tank Museum in Arsenalen, and what a beautiful museum it is. I've been fortunate enough to be there a few times now, and I absolutely love it.
It's a terrific museum, and actually in a lovely part of the world over there as well. And if you go to that museum this year, you see a tank museum vehicle. They've actually got our Porsche Turret King Tiger is on loan to them for the whole of this year. So if you're living in Sweden and you want the chance to see some really rare German Second World War armour, the Porsche Turret King Tiger is the only one in the world. Just behind us, a German's just been hit behind us. The battle's in full flow, as you can probably hear. The Germans are taking a bit of a pacing, to be honest. I think they're an armoured car and a couple of half tracks down, anti-tank going out of action. It's all looking a bit bleak. There's a Hetzer which is just retreating next to me. It's all kicking off, as it tends to at Tankfest, especially when you're here live in Bovington. And again, just if you want to be able to support our work here, do look up Filterfy and check out the Tank Museum there if you want to support us that way.
And also, don't forget, of course, the Tankfest Mega Sale 2022. Details on the portal, or again, make sure that you're checking out those Twitch drops.
And so the battle continues to rage behind. I think the Americans are making some quite good progress. The 29th Division, who we saw earlier, are currently launching their final assault by the looks of it. We're going to cut away in a second to carry on exploring the Tank Museum's Tankfest event. So the event isn't just what's going on in the arena. There's all sorts of activities around us. We had a chance earlier, as we saw Richard was exploring the living history area. But there's many more things than that. And actually, next up, Richard's going to be exploring the tank park, which is kind of the beating soul of the Tankfest event, where the tank crews are laid up, the volunteers who make Tankfest work, do their work. And Richard's going to be exploring that on our next video now.
I'm here now on the Vehicle Tank Park, where the guests of Tankfest actually form up prior to going onto the arena. It's a great place for visitors to go, not only, of course, to see the vehicles, but also meet the stars of the show, the crews of the vehicles. And one of those stars, do you like that, Frank?
Thank you.
I'm with here at the moment. It's Mr. Frank Wood from Eden Camp.
Hi, Rich. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And thank you so much for coming down, Frank. Frank, firstly, kick us off with a bit more about Eden Camp.
Yeah, no problem. Eden Camp's a World War II museum based up in North Yorkshire. We are basically the original buildings that were put up in 1942 that housed a population of German prisoners of war. Basically, the buildings have survived. We now look after those. That's our primary kind of goal. And we house our museum in those buildings. And we also have a vehicle collection. The vehicle collection includes our wonderful M50 Sherman. And good plug, eh? I did all right there, didn't I? Yeah, certainly good. And it's become quite famous today, certainly, as the blue one, because we've restored it as the Lebanese SLA, the Southern Lebanese Army Blue. And that basically was its last military incarnation. So we've got the history all the way from 1942 to 1982.
How was your trip down, Frank?
It was all right, yeah. It wasn't too bad. It was an early start. We've been very lucky in that the Tank Museum organised the transport with a low loader, and we sent a brilliant team up to collect our Sherman, and they transported it wonderfully safely. As you can see, it's here, so it's all right. It ends well, all right, doesn't it? So
let's have a little wander around the tank park. I mean, for you, anything particularly, obviously yours is the best, of course, you'd say, but anything that particularly sticks in your mind?
Yeah, well, yeah, the tank park's great because there's so much to pick from it. Though it's a massive gathering of vehicles from all different types and all different forces, which for me is brilliant. But my particular favourite this year is the M4A4, which we've ended up being part next to, which is really good because our Sherman as a standard back in 1942 was an M4A4. So it's been great to be able to directly compare it and look at the add-ons and the cuts and all the rest of it that have been made to make our vehicle into an M50.
Do you find it? I mean, as a crew, it must be really interesting that some of the questions that the general public come and ask you.
Yeah, interesting's a word for it. We do get, so I pride myself on a little bit of research. I enjoy that side of things, and we do get some brilliant questions, I have to say. And yesterday I was speaking to a guide in the Tank Museum who had questions I didn't know the answers to, and he was helping me learn. So that's been brilliant. I think it's always important to remain humble and be open to learning from other people and speak. And again, that's happened at Tankfest because I've met a guy who basically had a different knowledge to me, and between us we've cobbled something together. So it turns out our Sherman might have had a wading kit on it, which is again wartime and British and a really nice part of our story.
And why do you think, I mean, the importance of Tankfest, your personal opinion, why is it so important for people to come down here? And why do you think it's so popular?
I think, so I'm going to use an Eden Camp tagline to describe this. I'm going to use our little bitty, which is the sights, the sounds and the smells of World War II. And that's what we try to show people and talk to people about. And I think Tankfest absolutely evokes the same emotion and sensations here and there. So you certainly see them, you can certainly hear them, and they certainly smell. So I think probably that whole thing is really what we're talking about. And I think as long as we can use that as museum and as owners to speak about the history and side of things and help people understand why, where and what happened or could happen, I think probably that's a great thing, isn't it?
And as a vehicle owner, what's your biggest concern?
So I don't really have any concerns, I have to say. We're fairly easy and breezy today. Breakdowns, of course, are something that'll be proud, and everyone will be thinking about it. For me, I think breakdowns are breakdowns. It can happen in modern cars, can't it? It can happen if it was brand new or not. And I think really we've just got to remember that they are tanks, they're living, breathing things, and we want to show you them. So come and learn about them, and we'll tell you how we're fixing it if it breaks. Same difference in it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Frank. Hope you have a great Tankfest and good luck with everything.
No problem. Thank you.
We are live at Tankfest 2022, and that was the Tank Park, which is really the centrepiece of a lot of what happens here in terms of this living display of moving historic armour. As you can see, we give everybody a chance to actually have a walk around the Tank Park itself to see what's there and to speak to the crew. And what stood out for you there this year, Richard?
I think, as I said, the Tank Park is, and I said to you before, my favourite place of the whole of Tankfest, to be honest, because it's just where you get an opportunity to meet the crews. I'm not going to say a favourite because I'll be probably beaten up by various people who own the vehicles. But it was a great selection there, and again for the people to come up there and talk about their particular vehicle, the history behind it, and a lot of them, of course, give you the opportunity to have a look inside as well, which is very special for any visitor.
And as you've experienced yourself, that the driving a vehicle in real life, hearing it and seeing it is completely different from anything else you can possibly experience.
Oh, absolutely. You just can't, no matter how much you read about it, no matter how much research you do, nothing compares to seeing the vehicle drive around your arena or indeed just jumping into the turret and the smell of the oil.
Absolutely. And on the subject of driving vehicles, we saw earlier that Richard's still got it behind the Attilas of a Chieftain, but we decided we weren't going to leave it there. And instead of just on the Chieftain, we thought we'd give him a go of Leopard 1 for our next episode of Tank Top Gear.
This is the nimble Leopard 1. It's German, although this particular one was used by the Canadian Armed Forces. Weighing a relatively light 40 tons, it has an impressive top speed of 40 miles per hour and a range of 370 miles. This was West Germany's first foray into tank production since the war. And it turned out to be a roaring success, exemplifying the quality of German engineering. Porsche was involved in the design, and it's named after a big cat. But that's where the similarities to its World War II predecessors end. Because when you compare the Leopard to the Tigers, you'll see just how far German doctrine has shifted since their defeat to the Allies. Mobility was now the priority, ahead of armour and firepower. In so many ways, Leopard is the opposite of its contemporary and competitor, the British Chieftain. Leopard entered service with the German Army in 1965, serving until 2003 when it was replaced in German service by Leopard 2. It was developed around a version of the British L7 105mm rifled gun, the same gun that was used on the successful Centurion tank. But it is lightly armoured. At its thickest, it's 280mm thinner than the Chieftain. As a result, the crews would rely on speed and stealth to avoid enemy fire, which is a perfectly sound strategy if you've got an engine that actually works, and this one does. This engine is far more reliable and easier to maintain. So whilst blokes like me were sweating over the Chieftain on the tank park, our NATO friends were already getting the beers in. It also proved to be a tank that could be upgraded without compromising its performance, with a succession of upgrades to the armour, communications and the systems controlling the gun. As popular as it was with its crews, it was never seriously tested in combat. As a tank crewman myself, I would wonder how the reliance on mobility to get you out of trouble would have fared in defensive combat situations. Even so, Leopard 1 is a neat tank. But how does it perform on the track? The driver's cab is really together. And what I mean by that is that the startup procedure is straightforward, the controls are simple, and the driving position is absolutely fantastic. Now straight away, the big difference for me is I'm driving with no steering levers like I'm used to, but I've got this control lever directly in front of me. Now this is great. I think I did say the Chieftain steering was responsive. Well, I might have to withdraw that comment, as this is considerably better. It's almost a little too good. It takes a little bit of time to get used to, because you have to be quite careful. The first few turns you can actually oversteer, and it does turn the tank quite sharply. But again, this is nothing. After a few laps of the track, you can certainly get used to this pretty quickly. The automatic gearbox, dead straightforward, neutral into drive, foot on the accelerator, and away we go. The ride is smooth, it is fantastic, it's an absolute pleasure to drive. The only thing I wish for this vehicle is, A, I had more time, and B, that the track was considerably bigger. Leopard was a great export success, and I can see why. It's comfortable, light, nimble, and quick. It's almost fun to drive. Around 6,500 Leopards were built, serving with over 15 different nations, and several hundred are still in service today. Many nations that had previously operated Centurion opted for the Leopard instead of Chieftain, because despite having less armour and less firepower, it was quick, packed a punch, and crucially, it worked. Now you've seen how the Leopard rides in the arena, why don't you take it for a spin yourself in World of Tanks?
Welcome back live to here at the Tank Museum in the south of England in Bovington, and we're here at Tankfest 2022. Richard, Leopard 1, how does that compare to Chieftain then?
Well, I've just listened back to that, of course, and I thought I sounded a bit over-enthusiastic with Leopard 1, didn't I? So it's a bit embarrassing.
Feeling disloyal?
No, I was feeling slightly disloyal. I have to say, though, what a fantastic vehicle. I mean, it really was. The simplicity, the ride, the acceleration. As I said at the end there about the size of the track, I just wish you had a much bigger arena so you could really open it up. Joyous.
They do have a lot of oomph, don't they?
They do. I mean, it's I said I can't be disloyal to Chieftain. It'd be impossible. But of course, driving that straight after you drove a Chieftain was a marked difference.
So we're really fortunate. We've got a terrific collection of Leopard 1s here. We've got those. We've got 2 Canadian ones, which are great. They came to us about 2006. And we've also got a German one, and we're really looking forward. Actually, we're in the process of acquiring an Australian Leopard 1 as well, which will be another experience altogether as well.
And it's not just that you can hear the noise of the engine, can't you? It's just such an impressive engine noise as well. There's just everything about it. But again, I'm getting far too over-enthusiastic about a Leopard 1.
They do. Although they were built with that wonderful feature that Chieftain never had, which we call starting.
Of course, I mean, we're not talking. We were just looking at driving. We're not talking about the main armament and everything. And of course, Chieftain arguably did have the best main armament on that particular era tank.
Best tank in the world if it broke down in a good firing position.
Yes.
As we said, we are here live at Tankfest 2022. This is the Tank Museum's big fundraising event of the year, so you've got the opportunity to support us through Tiltify. Similarly, on World of Tanks, there's Twitch drops going on throughout the day. But our next segment is building on a pattern we've had so far, where we've been inviting our friends across the world to send vehicles to Tankfest many years. This year, they weren't able to bring anything, but we've asked them each to do a video about if you could have brought a vehicle to Tankfest, what would it be? In our next visit, we're heading off to North America, to the US Armour and Cavalry Collection in Fort Benning.
Hi, I'm Rob Kogan. I'm the curator here at the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection at Fort Benning, Georgia. The Armor and Cavalry Collection serves as the historic teaching collection for the U.S. Army's Armor School, teaching all American tankers and cavalry scouts the history of their branch, as well as the technical developments of the equipment used. So when the Tank Museum asked us to present a tank for Tankfest Online, there's a lot that come to mind. Vehicles that capture the imagination, that are almost larger than life. Vehicles like this German Tiger II behind me here that fought in the Battle of the Bulge. But today we're not going to talk about the Tiger II. No, we're going to talk about an American tank that was developed at the end of World War II, that was designed to actually kill Tiger IIs, to kill King Tigers. And that American tank is the T-29 heavy tank. By mid-1944, the U.S. Army already had the M26 Pershing tank, as it would be known, already developed. But the Pershing had only been designed to take on Tiger Is and Panthers. By the time the Allies are going in through northern France, we're starting to see the King Tiger, or Tiger II, already starting to make an appearance. And there was already a concern in the U.S. Army, what if we have to fight more of these heavy German tanks as we go further into the Third Reich? And so, starting in September 1944, the Army puts out a call for a new heavy tank, and that's going to be designated the T-29. So the T-29 should look pretty familiar for most fans of American tanks. The hull is actually just in a large M26 Pershing hull. They lengthened to accommodate 8 road wheels. And then finally, the track, while it's the same steel T-80 track initially put on the first Pershings, it's now been extended by adding extended end connectors, or duckbills, often referred to in history, to give it a wider surface area and better flotation. Propulsion was provided by the Ford GAC V12 engine, which gave it 770 horsepower at 2,800 RPM. The armor thickness on the front of the hull is actually the same as the M26 Pershing, only 4 inches of steel. The front of the turret is 7 inches thick steel. Looking at the gun shield here, it goes from 7 inches to 11 inches of additional steel. Now, the most important feature of the T-29 heavy tank is, of course, the T5E1 105mm main gun, designed to give it that edge over heavy German tanks. While the T-29 would never see actual combat surface and was only built in small numbers, it's important to note that it and its test variants would have dramatic effect on later American designs, including the M48 and M60 family of tanks. If you'd like to know more about what we're doing here at the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection, Please follow us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
You're watching Tankfest Online 2022. What a fantastic collection they've got there, Richard.
They have got some nice stuff, haven't they? We were really lucky a few years ago. We did a display of Tigers, and we had 4 of the 6 variants here as well. One of the ones we're missing was Elephant, and a conversation with my opposite number in the US got the Elephants coming our way, and actually adding something lined up. It was superb. It was actually a very generous loan by them. We had it here for about 2 years altogether.
And I've never been to see this collection, unfortunately. Have you?
It's got to be on the travel list.
Definitely on the travel
they've
list.
got some cracking stuff over there, and I think actually everyone who watches this stream today will get some really good holiday ideas.
And you're watching at the moment, you may be able to see, perhaps in the background there, we've just got some of the vehicles, some of the D-Day vehicles, so the US and the Allied vehicles forming up there. And this was all part of Armour and the Embarkation Parade, which was actually on last weekend, Richard, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was last weekend.
Armour and Embarkation. So it's a really paying a tribute to, the some 140,000 vehicles and 500,000 men that took part in that D-Day operation.
And many of those men actually stayed here in Dorset before they went off to fight in Normandy, and there's a real connection between people here in Dorset and particularly the US Army, who a lot of their people who left from here weren't able to come back home afterwards.
Don't forget, of course, to support the museum through the various means there, Patreon, Tiltify, etc. Do not forget to check out the World of Tanks portal as far as the Tankfest 2022 Mega Fest is concerned there.
But next up, we're going to carry on exploring the Tankfest site. Tankfest, as I said earlier, isn't just about what's happening on the arena. There's the museum itself. We've seen the tank park. There's the all sorts of things to explore and find out when you come here. And earlier on today, we saw Richard disappearing off with his wallet. And I'm wondering where he went to go next.
Now, there are plenty of places at Tankfest to spend your money, and I like nothing more than a good bargain. Now, of course, I'm here with a man at the moment who knows more than most about picking up a good deal. It's Mr. Bruce Crompton, of course, from Combat Dealers.
Lovely to see you again. I've got to
too,
be honest here. Wonderful to be here. The fact they crossed me between Del Boy and Del Winters means I like a good deal. But for anybody spending the day here, there are fantastic pickings. Listen, I love coming here. You know, I come every year. I'm a big supporter of the Tank Museum. Every year there's something different to see, somebody different to talk to. I've been asked to give a bit of a talk today, which I'm over the moon about. But it's nice to see you as well. I'll be able to get that tenner back you owe me.
Now, Bruce, I do believe we were talking before. We were saying, Armortech, the models. You've got a bit of a story about Armortech.
So with Armortech, years ago, I've actually got one of their Hetzer models. And when they were first doing the Hetzer model, must be 10 years ago now, they actually came up to our house and he's got one here. What they did was they actually took the sounds off of our running Hetzer, which was really cool. But again, now what they're producing, everything. I mean, I've got to be honest here, I'm half thinking of getting rid of all my stuff and going to this stuff. It's a lot cheaper to run and a lot better. But look at the beauty and the quality of these models. I mean, the Berg Panther, as you know, we finished a Panther ourselves last year. And believe me, that was a lot of work. But I think I'd rather have one of them. Doing that Panther, it broke the floor of my workshop. But it's just great to see these people doing a display on all these wonderful models they're doing, you know. Hopefully, if I stand here talking long enough, they might present me with one. No.
Bruce, I mean, the whole collective thing, how did you first get into it?
Right, for me, look, I've told the story many, many times. I've always been interested in military history. It is my passion. I've got to be honest, it's my passion. So 11 years old, I've been into, and I used to walk home past a guy's house, and at the bottom of his garden, he had a greenhouse with a German helmet with daffodils coming out of it. The last day I was at my primary school, I thought to myself, go on, go and ask. I banged on the door and I said, he went, what are you talking about, mate? I said, do you want to sell it? I didn't have a tanner, right? And he came back and he said to me, there you go. And he tipped the daffs out and he gave it to me. That started me. Now, from there, obviously, this passion, and okay, Second World War vehicles that we restore, wonderful, and I love to see these wonderful displays, but I'm interested in all aspects of history. Some of the kit they've got here from the First World War is superb. some of the stuff, more recent conflicts. You know, we mustn't forget about those guys, you know, that fought in Afghanistan, Iraq and everywhere else. They've just got a wonderful display of everything you could possibly want to see across the board here with every type of tank. I mean, I'm just looking there. Look at the arrangements there that they've got, the displays they've got. There's something for everybody here. There really is.
Now, in your collection, have you got a favourite?
I've got to be honest here, of my vehicles, it's probably still my Svinwagen, which is a German amphibious Jeep. Now, I got that in about 1985, and I got it from France, and it came from a monastery, and it's being used by the monks to go and get their groceries. And that's the first. I've still got that. It still runs beautifully. I'm really proud of it. It's probably my favourite vehicle. We've got a lot of bigger vehicles, obviously. You know, we've restored Panthers. We're doing Hetzers. We're doing 251s. We're doing all kinds of things. But I've got to be honest with you, my passion has always been my Svinwagen.
And to finish this off, Bruce, I mean, why should people come down to Tankfest?
Why should come down here? Because you don't know what you're missing. This place is the most fantastic place to bring anybody that's interested in military armour. It's the best tank museum in the world and a wonderful day out for everybody and their family.
Brilliant. Bruce, thank you so much for your time. Have a great weekend.
My pleasure. Give us that tenner. How's that?
We're here live at Tankfest 2022, and that was Bruce Crompton there of Combat Dealers fame, a great friend of the Tank Museum over many years. So, Richard, did you manage to find the wife's birthday present there today?
I think, Richard, I told you, I brought the wife. The last time was a pair of the Tank Museum shop slippers, the Tiger One slippers.
How did they go down?
Put it this way, not particularly well.
For our anniversary, I bought my wife, we've got these great ice cube moulds, and one of them's in the shape of a hand grenade, and I gave that to my wife for an anniversary present. Didn't go down well, nearly as well as I'd expected.
So, but I mean, wasn't it lovely to catch up with Bruce? I mean, he is an absolute, I mean, not only a font of information and knowledge, but what a genuinely really nice guy, and the stories he tells are just incredible.
And actually, the Bruce you see on the TV is the Bruce we see here regularly at the Tank Museum.
Absolutely, that is him.
There's no airs and graces. He's not trying to be someone else. That's Bruce Crompton through and through. He's a tremendous friend of the museum.
And for those of you watching, you can still see at the moment got the vehicles from the invasion days, the armour and embarkation parade going on there in the background. And of course, Weymouth and Port, very significant, the local area for D-Day.
Yeah, this is where the Americans sprang from to go. And then actually even around here in Swanage, for instance, where there are American units based, there's still graffiti from American soldiers in some of the guest houses. They found some recently in some lockers and some walls in guest houses where these guys were leaving their mark in very similar way. Actually, the previous war, it was all Australians. 120,000 Australians went through Dorset in the First World War. Now, we're going to move on to carry on torturing Richard with various challenges, where we gave him a chance to get behind the wheel of, or get behind the tillers of a Chieftain. He's had to go a Leopard, and we didn't leave it there because having not broken either of those, we thought we would complete the Western triumvirate and give Richard the chance of the next Tank Top Gear challenge to try out the American M60.
This is the M60. It's big, it's noisy, and it's brash. It has to be American. Weighing 47 tons, it's a top speed of 30 miles per hour and a range of 300 miles. And like other successful American tanks, it's so utilitarian and competent, so functional, that it's almost, well, a bit boring. The M60 does exactly what it says on the tin, but it lacks the experimental quirks of its British and German Cold War contemporaries. The reason for this is that unlike the Brits and the Germans, the M60 designers didn't sit down with a blank sheet of paper to redraw what a tank should be. The M60 is an evolutionary descendant of the M48, which is itself a descendant of the M46, which is a descendant of the M26, and it shows. The M60 entered service in 1960, becoming the USA's most numerous MBT during the Cold War years. Over 15,000 were built by Chrysler, and they would be used by over 25 other nations, with many still in service in Egypt, Turkey and Saudi Arabia. The key differences between the M48 and the M60 are specifically a bigger engine in the shape of the Continental V12 twin-turbo diesel, and also a better gun in the form of the British L7 105mm, as fitted to the Centurion and the Leopard 1. But surprisingly, there weren't any great improvements in armour thickness, at least initially. At its thickest point, the armour is 102mm, which is some way short of the 350mm boasted by the Chieftain. But this is another one of those designs with enormous capacity to be modernised and upgraded, and there have been a range of improvements applied to enhance mobility, armour protection and its weapon systems. The first nation to use them in anger were the Israeli forces during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where they performed well against the Soviet-built T-62. The US would deploy them in significant numbers during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, where they successfully took on the T-72. So don't get me wrong, the M60 is a decent tank. Its long service and combat records speak for itself. It just wasn't as groundbreaking as the Chieftain and Leopard. Let's see how it compares on the track. M60 first impressions, well, the starter procedure is particularly simple and straightforward, certainly the best of the three. Gear changes, semi-automatic gearbox, low and high ratio. I'm not that optimistic that I'll get into high, but maybe on the straight I'll certainly give it a go. The steering is very, very different to any other tank that I've driven before. You have to be really light on the steering, and there is a real tendency to overcorrect until you're used to it. All in all, you know, what can I say? It's a really functional vehicle. Even though the M60 remains in service around the world, its time was up with the introduction of the US's own step-change design, the M1 Abrams. The M60 is a great example of how a progressive system of upgrades can keep a weapons system viable for half a century. And when I say it's a bit boring, I suppose it's only boring in the same way as Sherman is boring. It's a tank that effectively and competently does the job it is designed to do, for which there aren't any major complaints. So if you want to take control of an M60 yourself, check it out in World of Tanks.
Welcome back live to Tankfest 2022. So, Richard, the three kind of classic Cold War Western vehicles, how do you rank them then?
Well, this is, I mean, it's hard to rank them as far as, let's just talk about the driving experience, perhaps. We'll leave sort of main armaments apart from that. I mean, I have to say there that talking about the M60 was an absolute delight. As I said, I mean, I did say it's a functional vehicle, but there's nothing wrong with that. You know, it absolutely does what it says on the tin. I would have to say pure driving, all right. I mean, I'm going to have to admit Leopard 1. We just had it in the bag there. For the other two, I'm not going to make any comment because, of course, I want to say M60 is 2 and Chieftain 3, but I'm not going to.
But deep down, the one you would take home to introduce to your mum would be Chieftain.
Absolutely, of course. Yeah, of course.
Naturally. It almost goes without saying. So we're here live at Tankfest 2022. You can see the display carrying on behind us, and it's not long before we're going to cut over to our main Second World War display live from the arena here. But in the meantime, we're going to carry on exploring Tankfest. And Richard's been carrying on. He's been looking around to see what's out there. A few minutes away ago, he was exploring and having a look in the inside of the Tank Museum's workshop with one of our trustees and volunteers.
I'm now in the workshops of the Tank Museum. Now, the Tank Museum relies heavily on the volunteers, and they are incredible people who give up their time and effort to come here and help on the vehicles. Now, one of these volunteers, who perhaps is maybe a bit more than a volunteer, he's also a trustee and also a vehicle owner, is William Bannister.
Hello there, nice to meet you again.
You too, William. How has your Tankfest been so far?
It's been good. I've had a bit of fun this morning playing out with the vehicles, and then I had to do my trustee thing, put my jacket and tie on and look respectable, and then back down in the workshops and helping the guys.
So how long have you been volunteering at the museum for now?
About 15 years. I was introduced to the museum, or reintroduced about 15 years ago by a friend of mine who used to be in the RTR, and came down here, decided that if you're going to support a charity, you might as well do something you're interested in. So came down here and started volunteering every month. And at that time it was a bit difficult because I was commuting from Scotland. So got on a plane, literally managed to do that for many years. And then actually I've now moved more locally to the museum, as well as doing other things, of course.
And of course, like I ask everybody, what is the passion about tanks?
I don't really know. I always liked them as a boy. Simple as that. You know, boys like trains, planes, dinosaurs. Tanks just seemed like great big dinosaurs, and I was just really interested in the history. And as you get older, you get interested in the military history, what people have done, all the sacrifice, all the things that we now look at as sort of important historical moments, and also the engineering side. So it's got it all really. And what's great being a volunteer over many years, and now I'm doing different sorts of volunteering as well, is just meeting lots of people. As I think we said, this is one place where you can feel normal because everybody's the same and everybody else is strange because we all like tanks.
Now, you are a vehicle owner, of course, as well. Your choice of vehicles?
It sort of happened because I started volunteering, then we wanted a volunteers project and managed to hear about the Stuarts that came into the country a few years ago from Brazil. So I've got my first tank is an M3A1 Honey, made in May 1942, and that's been restored and lives here at the museum. And then after that, we sort of slightly got carried away. And my motivation has been, as being able to help as a vehicle owner, is to try and secure vehicles that might be lost and the museum can't buy. And maybe if I can help and pay some restoration and running of them, we've got something that runs here, which is otherwise not running. So we may have an example in the museum, but actually not a working example. So that's what we try and do.
I've always been fascinated with the restoration of vehicles. I mean, for you and your vehicles, was there a particular part that you couldn't get hold of? Was there a particular something which was really painful and you thought at one stage?
You see the pain on my face. There's a lot of stuff that we actually find difficult to get hold of. It just depends on the vehicle, because actually something like the Stuart, there were quite a lot of parts around. It was in quite good condition, but again, you're sourcing certain bits from America and other places. We just finished a restoration of an M24 Chaffee, and that again we had sourcing parts from America, various trips to Holland, bits from Belgium, and that in some respects was slightly easier because that vehicle's been in service longer with NATO armies. And then the Sherman, which is the M4A4, which hopefully will be running well today, is the hardest of all because there are no multi-banks, only 3 multi-banks running in the world. So that's a really hard engine to find bits for, or anything, frankly.
Is there a dream vehicle you would love to own yourself, perhaps one day?
I don't really know, actually. As I say, the motivation is to get stuff that we can run here that otherwise are in the collection but not running. So that's the fun of it. So I don't really know. I've got a couple on my bucket list, but I won't tell you. I've got one in the pipeline. I've got one in the pipeline.
William, thank you so much for taking the time out to us. Final thing there, why should people come to Tankfest?
Because it's great fun. As I said, you can come here. If you like tanks, you're the person who's normal. Everybody else outside isn't. And I think you can meet everybody, see a lot of real kit, and it's the biggest movement of historic armour in the world. Can't beat that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, William. Welcome back to Tankfest Online 2022. Massive thank you, of course, to William there for spending some time with us. And I think what it does is highlight the significance and, of course, the critical importance of the volunteers to the museum, Richard.
Yeah, like many museums, we rely heavily on volunteers to really do what we do as an organisation. So here at Tankfest, basically, they're all out helping us. So we've got about 40, 50 guys helping us out over in the workshops, of which William's one of them here today. I think I saw him at the top of a Chaffee earlier. Austria. And we've got a host of volunteers helping on guiding, on ushering visitors, on checking tickets in almost every function. They really play a completely key role in what we do.
And as far as obviously William is a particularly, not only volunteer trustee, but also a vehicle owner. The vehicle owners, it's sort of, do you refer to it as a long-term loan or something when the vehicles come here?
It depends. So there's a number of vehicles who actually effectively live here at the Tank Museum. So actually William owns a number of vehicles which stay here, and actually we use them regularly in displays. But equally, we engage very heavily with a lot of the private owners, because they don't often get a chance to show their stuff off in public. And if you're going to own one of these vehicles, part of the joy of having it's like a classic car. You want it to be seen.
Show it.
Because that's part of the excitement of owning it. So everyone can say, wow, that's really cool.
And don't forget, of course, that to make sure Twitch drops there, you're keeping an eye on that. And also Tankfest, the 2022 mega sale on the World of Tanks portal.
Please carry on, do support the Tank Museum through whichever ways you go, whether it's a Tiltify or whether it's buying things from our online shop. Biggest seller in the last few years has been tank slippers, which are
not the tank slippers.
The tank slippers. I have my own pair. They are remarkably warm, and it's a great way, I find, to impress your teenage daughters. So give me the eye roll of love whenever I wear them.
And I think you've missed out here. We should have obviously been wearing Tankfest slippers when we did this.
We probably should have been. I think it would have completed the look, as opposed to the kind of the second-hand Formula One look, which we're currently, I think, pulling off really rather successfully.
Of course, Richard, first time back since obviously pandemic, all those problems there. What's it been like as a museum? To organise, I imagine quite manic.
Yeah, it's been challenging on many levels. And anyone who's running basically like we are, it's essentially a tourist attraction, has had a pretty rough time over the pandemic. We were closed for almost half of a 2-year stint. But we've come back in good shape, and we're really pleased that we've been able to do Tankfest in September last year, and we're back here in the sunshine in Dorset doing Tankfest once again. And it's we're going to be cutting over imminently now to our main event in many ways of Tankfest, which the centrepiece is going to be our Second World War Armour display. And the commentator for this is the museum's curator, who many be familiar with from YouTube. He stars in many ways alongside David Fletcher, and it's our very own curator, Mr. David Willey.
They have armour protection, they are given weapons, but in essence they're training tanks to get the German military up with the idea, this is what we're going to need and how we're going to learn the skills of using tanks. They've only made, don't forget, 20 tanks in World War I, so it's a new concept for the German military. And with the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, they're the tanks they want to build to go to war with. Now, Panzer III, that's going to be kind of like, as the British would call it, the cruiser tank. The tank that's going to go through the gaps made once an advance is started. Punch a hole in the front line. These are the tanks that go through the gap and have more mobility, supposedly more speed. Panzer IV is going to be helping punch that gap in the first place. They're given a short-barreled 7.5 centimetre gun. Now, we've been talking about the size of guns all day, 7.5 centimetre, the size of the hole at the end of the barrel. That Panzer IV was going to fire mainly high explosive shells with the idea so they can blast through positions, pillboxes, artillery positions, etc. And then this vehicle would come on behind, originally armed with the standard German 37mm anti-tank gun, but it's got its machine guns. They were just as considered as important early days for machine gunning, clearing the way ahead, and they would be the ones that go off and do the damage. Now, we all know the Germans, they put together their panzer divisions. They're starting to build these tanks in the later 30s. Hitler jumps the gun for the German military. He goes to war ahead of the game, and in 1940, about a third of those tanks that the Germans use invading France and Belgium and Holland, they're actually captured Czech tanks. They're ones that they've taken from Czechoslovakia and used those. 38T, 35Ts they're called. Now, our Panzer III that we're seeing rolling around now, the Germans, every time they improve on a model, they call it Ausrung A, B, or C. In other words, iteration or mark, we might call it A, B, C, etc. This has got down to Model L. and it's got a bigger gun. It's now got a 5-centimetre gun or 50mm gun. That's the anti-tank gun. We've seen it earlier being towed around the place behind that truck. They've put that on the vehicle, and they've added extra armour. We've now up to 5 centimetres of frontal armour on this vehicle. And as it parks up, you can see there's an extra piece bolted on the front to give it more protection, because by the time this tank is starting to see action, the British have now come up with their 6-pounder anti-tank gun, which has got more penetration than the earlier 2-pounder one. Really confusing, isn't it? Because the British start calling their gun size by the weight of solid shot fired, not by the size of the hole in the barrel, although we change that as the war goes on. Now, this vehicle, because it was going to North Africa, it's actually got additions to it. So they call this tropen, tropicalized. And they have extra filters so that the air is cleaned before it gets into the engine. Otherwise, all that dusty, sandy air of the desert will wear out your engine too quickly. Our Tiger has a similar arrangement. Tiger 131, because it was heading off to North Africa, they put extra what they call FIFO air filters on the back of it. Now, this vehicle, we know, was sent out to North Africa in April of 1942. It goes to the 8th Panzer Division. We think it was captured at the Battle of Alam Halfa. It's basically Rommel's last gasp push against the British positions before Alamein and Montgomery. He's taken a grip, as he would use it, of the 8th Army. He refuses to let them go and attack or leave their positions. Let the Germans blunt their attack on our own anti-tank defences and our new Sherman and Grant tanks that we've got out there. So this is captured then. You can actually see battle damage on it. One of those front sprockets has got a nice big hole from some shell firing. It was brought back to Britain. We have photographs of it being debombed out in Benghazi after its capture, taking all the ammunition out, so it was safe to transport back to Britain. And it goes up just off the M3 motorway, a place called Chertsey. That's where they did all the analysis in World War II, captured vehicles, so we could learn what's the best way of defeating it, any good ideas we can nick for our own tank design, etc. And then in 1951, this tank comes down to the Tank Museum, where it's become, well, a regular runner here pretty much ever since it came here. And it's now back in those original colours done by the workshops, Dunkelgelb, this sandy-looking colour that the Germans paint, not just for North Africa, but they paint most of their vehicles from about 1943 onwards in this look, and sometimes camouflage to the top. Now, 2 more relatively early war tanks. We've got a lovely vehicle on loan to us. Sometime soon, maybe in the next year or so, it's going to go back to Japan, where it was made, followed up behind it by the Stuart tank, the M3, or the British would call it a Stuart, the Americans the M3 light tank. Going to start with the Japanese tank first of all. It's called a Hargo, or a Type 95. And in the early 1930s, the Japanese, they've built a big heavy tank. They've imported a couple of tanks from Britain. They like the idea of the tank, but they want something faster. So the cavalry is saying, come on, if we're going to go ahead, or we've got lorried infantry, we can go about 25 miles, even 30, we're going to need a tank that can keep up. So a Japanese designer called Tommy O'Hara, that's his real name, not an Irish comedian, Tommy O'Hara, he comes up with this design. He comes up with a new bell crank suspension system. You'll see it rocking away there. Used to make the crew sick, so they add an extra bar between those 2 suspension systems. You can see front and back to try and lessen the rocking motion of the vehicle. It's got relatively thin armour for the time, and it's got a 37mm gun, which when this was first being produced, they start making them in 1935, that's not a bad gun to have on a tank. It fires armour-piercing or high explosive rounds together. Now, the problem with it, it's quite cramped. You've got a 3-man crew, 2 in the hull, driver and another gunner there, and you've got the commander on his own up in the turret. And in the back, because of one of those British tanks the Japanese had imported, in the back of the vehicle, there's actually a Mitsubishi diesel engine. The Japanese like the idea of diesel because it's harder to actually set on fire than petrol, and they've had this bad experience with a petrol engine. So a diesel engine to try and lessen the risk of fire. This vehicle has very little opposition up to 1939 when it's being used in countries. Japan's advance into China. It only in 1939 at a place called Khalkhin Gol does this tank meet Russian tanks under Marshal Zhukov. And by that, the Japanese military get a bloody nose. For the first time, they have met a force that's as strong, if not stronger, and better led than them. And that stops the Japanese from actually taking on the Russians at all. And of course, then later in the war, this tank seems to be outclassed when it starts meeting American tanks in the Pacific. But Japan's aim early on in the war, it's really about naval power to get its influence around the Pacific. Tanks are very secondary to the Japanese. Now, the vehicle following up is the M3 light tank, designed in America. It was put together in a bit of a hurry from component parts the Americans had been testing throughout the 1930s. Only in 1940 does America get back together to reform an armoured force. An armoured corps is put together to have tank divisions. It's been done away with after the First World War. They separate the tanks into what they call combat cars to get round a Senate ruling. They give some to the cavalry, some to the infantry. This is now going to be a tank for this new force, a new armoured force. They use a radial engine. It's got an aeroplane engine in the back. You can hear that noise of that. It's an R975 radial engine in the back of the vehicle to power it along, and that's quite high. That's why the rear of the vehicle looks quite high up. 37mm gun. So about the same size gun, but it's got more velocity, more Willey coming out behind the rounds than the one on the Hargo tank. And one of the problems, though, with the M5 is range. It doesn't go that far, only about 75 miles an hour. That one's painted up as a British one. The British were first to use it in Operation Compass later in 1941. Now, it's replaced later. We're going to see how it's replaced as well. First of all, they do an upgraded version of that tank called the M5, and then they come up with something called the Chaffee, and we're going to see the Chaffee in a moment. Before that, here comes a very unique vehicle. In fact, it is the only one left of what's called a Valentine DD tank. DD, duplex drive. It means you can drive this vehicle two ways. One on its tracks, that we can see it now, but that sausage of canvas that you can see around the hull is a second way you can drive it. It can float. The canvas screen comes up and it displaces enough water that it will float across a river, lake, or even in the sea. And the second way you can drive it, they can lock the propellers that are on the back into the engine and drive it that way and spin the propellers to take you through water. Now, the whole idea of this, it's through a guy called Nicholas Strausler. He's a Hungarian who's working in Britain. He knows we're trying to find ways to float tanks. In the museum, we've got a Mark IX, First World War tank. They floated one of those in World War I. The last day of the war, there's one of those floating on a lake in London. They know you need to float tanks to get across rivers, maybe for sea landings, etc. So they know they're going to have to do that again, especially as we've got to re-invade Europe. So they start, Strausler starts with a light tank, gets it to float, gets the idea, a Tetrarch tank. He then moves on to the Valentine that we can see here. And this particular Valentine, it's got the longer gun, what they called, it's basically a quick-firing 75mm. It's basically the British 6-pounder bored out to take American 75mm ammunition. That's part of its problem. If you look at the gun as it faces forward, it overhangs that canvas screen. So the only way it could float properly is you turn the gun in reverse and float ashore with it facing towards the back. They test these vehicles. All the guys that are going to go ashore on D-Day are trained on these Valentine tanks. Just before D-Day, April 1944, down the road at Cutland Harbour, not far from here, they test some of these in fairly rough weather. Exercise smash. 6 of them sink to the bottom. 6 guys' lives are lost. Only 1 guy gets washed up. And some of those tanks are still there in Cutland Harbour. The British learned from this. Take the tanks very close to the beach. They were going to be launched 4 miles out on D-Day. Go in 2 miles, as close as you can. Take that risk of shell fire, launch them closer. Now on D-Day, of course, they use the Sherman DDs. We've got one in the museum. Their gun is shorter, so it can be facing forward. And the key thing there is they knew they wanted those screens to go down, and almost instantly they need those guns available for firing at the enemy positions on the beaches. That's why they needed the Sherman version, and they only use these for training. They're used for training to the end of the war. Some of them do actually see, they cross the River Po in Italy. They're used to bring up ammunition, etc. But this is the last remaining one. The owner, John Pearson, is there at the moment. He got the hull out of the bottom of a factory. The turret was broken up, and he spent years putting this vehicle back together. The screen does go up. He can demonstrate that, but quite sensibly, he's never going to float it on the ocean again. We don't want to see another last remaining Valentine DD sunk. 8,000 Valentines made in the Second World War. It's a tank Britain makes the most of, but we tend to forget about. 2,000 of those are made in Canada. Most of the Canadian ones are sent straight to support the Red Army. They're sent straight over to Russia, supporting the Red Army. Great tank, reliable. 2 types of diesel engines, AEC, GMC diesels in the back. You know, it was a really good, successful tank from the British point of view. Now, we're going to see some classic Second World War American armour coming on now. I won't talk too much about the Sherman. I mentioned the fact that America, it reforms its armoured force. It's not, of course, actually involved in the war till December of 41, but the American military, we've got British and French agents going over to America saying, can you build tanks for us? The American military quite rightly turns around and says, well, why not go in with us into the designer tank we're going to make? So we end up buying the M3 Grant tank, then the M4 Sherman, then we get Lend-Lease, so we're given these vehicles to help fight the Nazis. And the Sherman is what the American armoured divisions are going to want to use. And the armoured division, their philosophy is, once we're attacking, these are the tanks to go forward at speed and exploit the breakthrough. The American doctrine at the same time was thinking about what happens, because they've seen Blitzkrieg in Europe in 1940, what happens when the enemy come the other way with their tanks, like the Panzer IIIs and the Panzer IVs. And instead of thinking the tank's the best weapon to knock them out, they come up with a doctrine that they call the tank destroyer doctrine. And he says, looking back, the third vehicle in that lineup is something called the M18 Hellcat. Not a tank, technically, even though it looks like one. It's what the Americans would call a tank destroyer. And the idea here was their doctrine was going to be put a gun on a fast carriage, and that, to start with, was half-tracks, like you can see in the middle there with that M16 half-track. Put a gun on that. It can speed to where the enemy are broken through and try and knock out their tanks in ambush. Then they say, let's put it on a track chassis so it can go everywhere. And they make something called the M10 Tank Destroyer. And then they move on to that M18, which is even thinner armoured and faster to get to where a breakthrough might be. Now, with that M18 tank destroyer, only half-inch thick armour, nowhere near as thick as on this Sherman tank. They put in the back of it another one of those aeroplane engines to power it along. This particular, they'll let the other guys talk about the engines in this Sherman, but that vehicle has got that radial R975 aeroplane engine in the back to give it speed. And the M18 as well, it's got an open top turret. So the guys inside have got really good all-round visibility, so they can see supposedly the enemy tanks they're going to be trying to knock out. 55 miles an hour, the M18, that's very fast for a tank. So I say a tank destroyer, I should say, of course. So that doctrine, when the Americans go to Europe, Sherman tanks for the breakthrough and exploitation, enemy tanks coming the other way, we're going to try and knock them out with tank destroyers. Quite simply, it doesn't work. The doctrine fails, so they stop using tank destroyers in the way they were planned. They were going to make 8,000 of these M18 tank destroyers. They stop at 2,000 because the message is coming back to people like General McNair back in America. This is a failed doctrine. Even Patton says it doesn't really work for us. You can't have the right vehicles in the right place at the right time. So in the end, the Sherman, they upgun that Sherman tank. We see our Fury one in a moment, has a 76mm, the same gun they put in this M18 Hellcat to try and knock out enemy tanks. The end result is, at the end of World War II, your best way of defeating a tank is with another tank, because it's got armour protection, it's got mobility to get to the same places as the enemy tank has, and that seems to be the best way of doing things. Now, the Hellcat, the M18 there, does have its moment. They have success at September 44 at the Battle of Arracourt, where about 4 of these are knocked out, but they managed to take out just over 30 German tanks. And they're used very effectively in the Battle of the Bulge at Bastogne. There's a crossroads in a small village. The speed of these are going at 55 miles an hour, race ahead. They capture the village before the Germans get there, and they lay a very good defence. Now, this particular M18, we know, went to Europe. It then goes back to America. They were rebuilt, and there was a program in the 1950s where there was basically American support for Tito in Yugoslavia. We didn't want Tito to go to communist Russia. We wanted him to accept material from the West. And this tank was one of those given to the Yugoslavian military. If you've all been watching films like Kelly's Heroes, all those Shermans in Kelly's Heroes, they're ones that America gave to the Yugoslav army to try and reinforce them and to get Tito on our side, as it were. When Yugoslavia broke apart many years later, this was in combat when the Serbs were fighting each other. And if you look at the front of this vehicle, there's actually a hole in it where it was knocked out. And then back in 2002, this was imported into the UK, restored, and it's now privately owned by the owner who's driving it at the moment. Now, there's a symbol on the side there, Tank Destroyer Command. That was based at Fort Hood in America. Early in the war, lots of interest in this doctrine. Very quickly, though, it fades away. And by the end of the war, many of these tank destroyers, they disband half the units and spread the tanks out for use as support amongst the infantry instead. Now, the other side of the world, the Russians, they've got into tanks very early on. They import some British Vickers tanks. They send their agents to the Vickers factory in England. 1930, they buy the export, the Vickers export, or we would call it the 6-ton tank. They rebuild those. They build them under license in the Soviet Union, and they build a lot of them. Soviet Russia is the one country that really builds a lot of tanks in the 30s. Most other countries are experimenting or seeing where the tank might go at that time. But at the end of the 30s, a Russian designer, Mikhail Koshkin, comes up with a design which becomes this fellow at the front there, the T-34 tank, originally with a smaller turret, 76mm gun. He offers it to the Red Army that are a little bit dubious about it. They've just got a new big heavy tank called the KV-1 going into service. Stalin likes the idea of this, so the Red Army jumps and says, yes, of course, sir, we'd love it too. The Red Army in 1941, they've just gone through a purge, 40,000, can you imagine that? 40,000 officers and senior ranks have been killed or exiled by Stalin. So when the Germans invade, they've got, the phrase was stumbling colossus, the Red Army, a massive army, but hardly any real leaders left to form a sensible defence or use tanks like the T-34 to their best effect. Now, they move the factories out the way of the advancing Germans, and that's when the Russians start learning, actually, the things we're putting on tanks you don't really need in combat. Let's simplify the design. Let's remove things that are unnecessary, because we're going to need lots of tanks to replace the literally tens of thousands they lost in the original German invasion. So the T-34, it goes through a development. 1943, they meet the Panther tank coming from Germany. So they decide, instead of building a brand new tank to replace it, they design one, T-44. They say, no, let's do evolution. Let's get a bigger gun with a bigger turret, and that's what we're seeing now. It's an 85mm gun, hence T-34-85. Bigger turret, we can now get 3 people in the turret, as opposed to the earlier 2, but they carry on making them in really big numbers. Now, by the end of the war, they reckon about 70,000 T-34s have been built. Very effective, very simple, used in almost like the West would use a hand grenade, 10 or 5, however many needed, just to try to advance to the next position. Here's another 10 coming to replace the earlier ones if you lose them. It's also the most knocked out tank in the Second World War. So pretty rough on those tank crews that were inside it, but seen by many to be a very successful design for the way the Russians wanted to fight their war. Now, the tank running around at the moment that's mobile, this is that replacement for that earlier war American light tank, the M3, then it was improved to the M5 model. This one's called the M24 Chaffee, named after the American general Edna Chaffee. 75mm gun, so sounds similar to the Sherman. It's actually a different model 75mm. And again, torsion bar suspension, these twisted bars, so it's got a good smooth ride across country, nice angled armour, and some very clever designs go into this vehicle. It's got dual controls on the front, so if the driver gets wounded or too tired, the guy next to him can take over and drive the vehicle. And again, quite a speedy vehicle. You can get up to 35 miles an hour in a Chaffee. They start seeing action at the end of 1944, and this one is painted to represent one that was issued to the British. It was given to a chap, young officer called Bill Bellamy, took over one. We've got his story in the galleries. He wrote a wonderful memoir, and this they've done as Hemlock 3. That was the name of his tank that he was using in 1945. Now, the Chaffee, it goes on to see service with lots of other armies around the world, well into the 60s and 70s. They were used in Vietnam, they were used in French Indochina, all sorts of places. So it's another tank that survived in quite large quantities, about 4,000 of them actually made in the war, so that they're still around. And that's another reason tanks are here at the museum. If they were in service longer with other armies, that helps us. There's a chance they can be preserved. Now, we've got a British tank to finish up with, which is a late war British tank. Churchill emphasised early in the war, once we lost those tanks in France, he put aircraft and the Navy as the first industrial priorities, quite sensibly. We needed fighters to defend ourselves against Germany, and we needed then bombers to get back, and the Navy if they'd crossed the Channel. So tank design sort of has almost like a 2-year gap in Britain. But when we come back with the Cromwell tank, we start getting the act together again. And this is the Comet tank with, in the back, a Rolls-Royce Meteor engine. Now, many people will have heard of the Merlin engine that's in the Spitfire or the Lancaster bomber. A chap working for Rolls-Royce with a great name, Rumpty Rowbottom, ends up getting crashed Merlin engines from crashed planes, works on them, derates them, puts them together for a new model engine to go in a tank. And that gives this vehicle 600 horsepower. At last, we've got a really powerful engine. We've got a new gun we've been developing. This is a 77mm high velocity gun. It looks like the 17-pounder. It fires the same projectiles from the 17-pounder, but it's got a different brass shell case. But we've now also got new ammunition types in Britain. So we can now fire a tungsten slug from this gun surrounded by a pot of metal. They call that discarding sabot. And the idea is when the round comes out the end of the barrel, it flies forward, the pot of aluminium falls away, the slug of tungsten, no explosive in it at all, goes towards the enemy tank, supersonic speed, and just that sheer kinetic energy behind the tungsten will smash its way through enemy armour. And that gun firing discarding sabot is actually more effective than the 7.5 gun on the famous German Panther. So Comet tank driving off there now was a British success. It only sees fighting in the end of the war, but it's also part of that reasoning, knowing why we ended up using so many American tanks. Quite simply, we had other priorities at the time. So we're now going to hand over and move straight on to look at the Sherman tank story. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleagues Stuart and Tim Broad to look at this range of amazing Sherman tanks.
Thank you, David. Now, Stuart and I are going to be having a look at not only one of the more iconic, there's that word again, one of the more iconic tanks of the Second World War, but probably one of the most important. The Germans only ever managed to make just a shade over 1,300 Tiger Is and round about 6,000 Panthers. The Americans during the war made very nearly 50,000 Shermans. So we're looking now, the first three vehicles coming along are some of those vehicles that helped the Allies win the Second World War, to overwhelm, if you like, the German defences with sheer production power of the West. I ought really to be asking you to listen closely to the engine notes as each of these vehicles goes past. There is a reason for that. Once America got into its wartime production, and it did that with incredible facility. Immediately before the Second World War, the American car industry, for instance, was making tens of thousands of cars every year. In 1942, it made 136. The rest of its production was dedicated to the production of tanks, specifically M3 Grants and M4 Sherman. Just about every major engineering company in America, whether they made locomotives or cars or trucks or whatever, were turned to producing Sherman. But they didn't all have access to the same power packs. They had to make use of what they could get their hands on. Some of them turned in the sort of classic tank way to the aero engine as a power pack. Now, the first tank that's parked up here is an M4A1, known to the British as a Sherman 2. And in the back there is something called a Continental Radial Engine. Now that is an aircraft engine of a kind of vertical radial. If you imagine the sort of thing you'd see on the front of... Do you remember in the Indiana Jones film, that Ford Tri-Motor that he jumps out of? That had radial engines on the front. There's one of those in the back of that tank. It means the hull has to be deep enough to take that engine. Hence, the Sherman has always been a rather tall vehicle in comparison to others that we've seen, if you imagine it, say, in comparison to the Panzer Mark III that we saw. The characteristic point about the M1A1 is its cast hull. It's got that very characteristic rounded look to it. Now, you might think, well, okay, this is the A1, they built that, then they built the A2, and then the A3. It wasn't as simple as that. These companies were producing their version of the Sherman at the same time. So you had A1s and A2s and A3s being produced at the same time. One of the questions I often get asked after the film Fury is, do all Shermans have escape hatches underneath? The answer is no, it depends who built them. Some did, some didn't. Now, the A1 was the sort of Sherman which we used at Alamein in 1942 and proved the equal of any German tank at the time. The gun it's got on it there is relatively modest velocity, 75mm. Very, very good in 1942. By 1944, it had been outgunned by the Germans. So we're going to move on now to the M4A2. There's Fury, look, sitting there. The M4A2 was designed with a twin Detroit diesel engine in the back. So unlike the Aero engine, this has got twin diesels. The Fury tank here is interesting because it shows us that not only did these various companies continue to make the different types of Sherman at the same time, but existing Shermans were upgunned, improved, right? You'll notice our Fury here has got a different suspension system from the other tanks, or the other World War II tanks we've got here. The A1 coming past us now has got something called vertical volute spring suspension. That's the type of suspension that America had been working on before the war. It was the sort of suspension on the Grant tanks that were first sent out to the British in the desert. On Fury, we have got horizontal volute spring suspension. It was a better suspension system, gave you a better ride, gave you a better gun platform, and Fury's also been upgraded here with a bigger 76mm gun. So whereas the gun on Belle, as she's driving out there now, could not penetrate the frontal armour of a Panther tank at all, Fury could penetrate her from a distance of about 1.5 kilometres. Now, the final Second World War tank there is the A4, which was the most common type issued to the British, and was the basis of the British Firefly. The Firefly was the tank which had that 17-pounder anti-tank gun shoehorned into the turret. It's got the controversial Chrysler multi-bank engine in the back there. Chrysler didn't have access to big, beefy diesel engines, so what it did was took 5 car engines, bolted them together around a single drive shaft. Now, if that sounds complicated, it's because it was. It was a 30-cylinder engine. The Americans didn't much like it. It was very, very complicated to maintain. Brits, on the other hand, were quite okay with it. And most of the Shermans that most Brits went to war in were the A4 version you'll see coming up here now. Now, if you look closely at her, you'll notice that she's got extra armour welded to the side. The Sherman, during the Second World War, had very bad press. This was the Tommy Cooker, as the Germans called it, the Ronson, as we called it, because Ronson cigarette lighters light first time, every time. Part of the reason was that in the early versions of the Sherman, the ammunition was stowed dry, just where you can see that applique armour on the side. Later examples used a wet stowage, which meant that there was less chance of a flash fire if the tank were penetrated. The applique armour also helped, although I have seen some reference from veterans suggesting that all it did was give an aiming point to German anti-tank gunners. So, we've seen 3 of the 4 types. We don't have, unfortunately, an A3 here, although Fury looked a bit like an A3. That was the idea behind the movie making. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Stuart, who's going to deal with these 2 beauties up here on the bunt.
Thanks very much, Tim. What we're looking at here in the lovely blue colour is a M50, and behind it is the M51. What you can see flying from the flag flying from the M50 is the Southern Lebanese Army flag. This Israeli M50 was given to the Southern Lebanese Army in 1982. Really what we're talking about with these two vehicles is basically upgunning. Okay, so in 1948, 1949, you have the War of Independence for Israel. They're fighting against Arab nations. They're all using obsolete tanks from World War II. And essentially what happens is 75% of the tanks that the Israelis are using are Shermans. And they focus in on the Sherman because they know how to use them, they've got experience of them, and they fought during World War II. What they're looking to do, though, is upgun them, because what's happened is the Arab states start to get T-34-85s and Su-100s, and the standard 75 and 76mm Shermans can't really do too much damage. So what they start to do is they look around to see if someone can supply them with a gun that can allow them to upgun it. They look to the French. There's an embargo on them buying new tanks, but they look to the French because the French aren't happy that the Egyptians are supporting the Algerians in the French-Algerian War. So they're a bit happy to help. And what they look at is that on the AMX-13, they're using a modified Panther gun. That's the L70 on the Panther. They're using it for their new model, the AMX-13 light tank. And what they do is basically take this gun and look to put it in that turret. So this is an M4A4. It was a French tank after World War II. They got hold of obsolete tanks. Israelis are buying obsolete tanks, and that's 1/6 of the price of an AMX-13, so they're very cheap. No one wants them. And basically what they do is they chop the back off of the turret and effectively put an extra part in, so they make the turret longer. This means that they can take the longer gun and put it inside that turret. They also fill the bottom of that turret at the rear with lead, so the turret can traverse when it's on a slope. They also make the actual mantler and shields at the front bigger, so they've increased its ability. So that becomes the tank killer, and that can knock out penetrate through 175 millimeters worth of armour. They put VVS suspension on it, and basically they try to get as many as possible with the Chrysler engines inside there. Basically, they're trying to reduce the amount of types of vehicles they're using. So the Sherman's the key one. And this would have fought in the 1956 war in October and November around the time of Suez, where they were fighting against the Egyptians. And that proved itself there. Good against the T-34-85 and Su-100. The problem is basically the T-54 and T-55 and the IS-3 arrive. They start arriving in the 1960s. They're starting to supply to places like Egypt, etc. And so the Israelis recognise that they have to upgun again. And what they do is they look towards the M4A1 and the T-23 turret. They also look to the French again. The French are working on the AMX-30, and they're actually looking at this 105mm gun. And this 105mm gun is a rifle gun, and they're looking to put that into this turret, the T-23 turret. So they have to do what they did with the M50 and take the rear off again and weld extra plates in it to elongate it. They reduced the chamber as well inside, and also the length of the gun. So they reduced that to basically by 1.5 meters. And what they do is effectively create the gun to fit inside the tank.
And don't forget, of course, that the majority of the vehicles that you've seen in these arena shows can actually be played in World of Tanks. Richard, fantastic there, 2 amazing displays, Sherman Stories and World War II Armour.
Really rare selection of vehicles. You don't see those every day. And actually, I thought things like the Hargo was absolutely tremendous.
Do you know, I was just going to say that's probably my favourite, really.
That's the only runner in the world. We've got it on loan here at the moment. It goes off probably sometime this year over to Japan. But it's been an absolute treat to have it here.
And of course, don't forget there, as a reminder there, say play World of Tanks. Don't forget the mega sale we've got as well. All the details on the World of Tanks portal. And of course, don't forget about those Twitch drops. So stay tuned for that.
And also you can support the Tank Museum. We're a registered charity here in Bovington, and we need your support to keep these vehicles running for the public for years to come. You can support us through Tiltify, which is one of these giving kind of tools. If you want to know how to give on Tiltify, click the link in the description that you'll see attached to this video, and that'll take you to the right place. If you don't want to go through Tiltify, you can support us through Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or if you actually, the alternative is go and buy something online shop. There's everything you could ever possibly want there that's tank related.
And of course, Richard, I mean, are you already prepping for next year?
Yeah, so Tankfest 2023 planning starts tomorrow. And actually, it's also worth saying, if you are interested in going for Tank Museum for Tankfest 2023, tomorrow you can actually start buying your tickets for next year as well. The Saturday tends to sell out quite early, so if you're interested in flying over, make sure you get your tickets. We have had the unfortunate situation in the past of people arriving from overseas who had not bought their tickets beforehand, which is always a slightly awkward moment. Anyway, we're here live at Tankfest 2023. You can see the arena behind us. We're queuing up for the next part of the show here. And the next segment that we've got is going to be covering Cold War armour, which, Richard, that's your era, isn't it, Cold War?
Just to make you sound remarkably old, you say that's your era. But yes, it is. You're right. You're correct. It is my era, of course. That's when first tank I trained on was the Chieftain tank.
Yeah, and in some ways, the Cold War is the kind of the pinnacle of tank dominance. The Cold War was expected to be a war where the tank was completely centre stage, wasn't it?
It was, and when we first, I mean, for training, I mean, it's quite remarkable when you look back on it. Everything was, you know, the Soviet threat. Everything was around the Soviet threat. My first posting in Germany, we were based in a place called Paderborn, where we literally every month used to take the tanks up to dug-in fire positions, I hasten to add, and wait there just in case.
Yeah, and again, we're seeing tanks very much the centre of the news again at the moment. The debate starts once again. Is the era of the tank dead? What's your take on that?
It is, well, put it this way. I joined the army in 1983-ish, and I heard then that this was the last year that the tank would actually be of any use at all on the battlefield. And of course, it isn't. I mean, every time we go. But of course, what we are seeing lately is a complete lack of combined arms operations.
Yeah, and certainly it's interesting. There's a pattern really almost every 20 years, ever since right at the end of the First World War. There's been this debate about tanks were the last war's weapon. In the 1920s, there was an assumption of there'll never be a conflict like that again. At the end of the Cold War, we saw it. We're seeing it again now. And there does seem to be this pattern where whenever the fighting starts, someone feels it's a good idea to have the biggest gun and some decent protection.
Absolutely, and of course, I mean, the fundamental thing about a tank is nothing holds ground like a tank. So it's all very well, you take it, but it is the tank. It's tank and infantry that can hold a position.
But we're here live at Tankfest, and as you can see behind us, our Cold War display is now starting, and we're going to cut back over to the Tank Museum's very own curator, David Willey.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you get an impression there. Imagine being an infantryman in a foxhole with that sort of noise coming over from behind the hill. You can see that a tank has a power over and above just the weapon systems it carried. Right from the word go, from the first tank attack in September of 1916, the tank has a psychological impact over and above its weapons, and you can see that now with these driving around. Now we're going to start off. Let's have a look at that little. Some of the blokes in the audience might recognise. We've got a Scorpion tank there. That was the Action Man tank. It was designed for the British Army back in the 1960s. Aluminium armour is becoming popular. That makes it lighter. They've got to find an engine to fit the Scorpion. It's a problem because the driver gets in the front. The engine's got to fit in a gap beside him. The only one they can find powerful enough is actually from the Jaguar E-Type sports car. So that engine is in the front there next to the driver. 76mm gun, so we're back to that size that was on the Sherman in World War II. Can fire a range of different ammunition types. It's medium velocity. In other words, the rounds don't come out the barrel with a massive amount of force behind, but you don't want to take on another tank unless you're very brave in this. But it will fire Hesh rounds. They pancake against the armour of another tank and they send a shockwave through it. It could fire smoke. It could fire canister rounds as well. And it was also the parent vehicle for a whole family of vehicles. We're going to see one still in service a little bit later with the British Army. It's a family they call CVRT, Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tracked. And the Scorpion is still in use in the Far East. Other countries have put new guns in it. The British took it out of service, mainly because it was apparently had a dirty gun. Too many fumes in the turrets that could affect the crew. Now, the next little light vehicle that's driving off there, after the Second World War, France tries to set up its own military and tank and armaments industries again. And this is an offering originally designed for the French paratroopers, AMX-13, 13 tons in weight. That was the aim. So again, it could be air portable, get out to those French colonies around the world still. It ended up being sold to quite a number of countries. 26 countries ended up using this because it was cheap. It was small. You could buy it. You could afford one of these. You might not be able to afford too many bigger main battle tanks. And the French started it with a 75mm gun, like Stuart said, based on the gun on the Panther. They then upgrade it, a 90mm gun if you wanted it. And even a bigger gun, 105mm, you could buy on an export model. Now, it's got a very different shaped turret to most tanks. It's called an oscillating turret. The whole top half goes up and down with the gun stuck to that top half. And because the gun doesn't move in relation to the top of the roof of the tank, that means you can bolt an auto loader to the roof. And this has actually got 6 cartridges of ammunition for that 90mm gun either side in that turret bustle. Once they fired off 12 rounds, the vehicle's really got to get out of action to reload. But it's one of those first automatic loading systems in a mass-produced tank. They reckoned they make over 100 different variations, depending on what country you are, what engine you wanted, thickness of armour, ammunition type. So a very popular tank, and is still in service around the world at the moment. French Army got rid of it many years ago. Now, just seeing what was going to move next, the Centurion tank. The British tank we designed at the end of the Second World War misses action by a few weeks. The early model with a British 20-pounder gun on, it then gets upgraded. And the really important story that affects all these tanks here, 1956, a Russian tank is driven, the T-54A, into the British Embassy compound in Hungary during the Hungarian uprising. The defence attaché measures the thickness of the Russian tank's armour and sees a 100mm gun. And that panics NATO, because we worry now our own guns are not going to penetrate the Russian tanks. So that leads to a development of Royal Ordnance. They come up with a new gun, L7 105mm, so 10.5 centimetres on the end of the barrel. We put it on our Centurion tanks from the early 1960s, and it's a game changer. It really is very, very effective, so everybody wants it. Now, this particular Centurion tank, it was sold to Switzerland in 1955. Originally had the 20-pounder gun on. But all the Swiss Centurions, like the British ones, were upgraded. So it's now got that newer L7 105mm gun on, much more powerful. Switzerland, after World War II, realised it wants tanks. It wants to buy the Centurion from Britain as early as 1950. It has a problem, though, because the Korean War starts. Britain needs its own tanks for itself and for its Commonwealth allies and for NATO. So that's why the Swiss have to wait 5 whole years before they can buy that Centurion. Meanwhile, they bought some of those AMX-13s we saw driving off. Now, NATO, in this Cold War period, Germany, don't forget, is divided between East and West. East Germany on the communist side, West Germany, the capitalist Western side. The West Germans are finally allowed in 1955 to reform an army. We want them as part of NATO. Originally, they're given American tanks, but then they start a program, originally with the French, to build a new tank for their army. And this is what comes out. The deal between the French and the Germans, they fall apart, they go their own way. The French make a tank called the AMX-30. The Germans make this tank, the Leopard. And this time round, they go for speed and mobility rather than that thick armour protection they had at the end of World War II on tanks like the King Tiger or the Panther. This has got a thumping great big MTU diesel engine. You can hear it rumbling away there to give this vehicle speed and power to dash about the battlefield. And when the Germans decide on a gun, what do they want? They want that British L7 105mm gun. So that's what's actually equipping this tank. Mobile, fast. This particular one that's just driving off there actually came from Canadian forces. They gave us some when they got rid of their tanks in the year 2000. They then went off to Afghanistan to fight. Very quickly realised they dropped a big one and had to go back to the Germans and say, can we buy some more tanks off you, please? So here's the story again. Most countries that get rid of their tanks end up wanting them again. The Netherlands got rid of their Leopard tanks. They're now hiring a battalion of Leopard tanks back from the Germans so they can train with them. So what was the problem? What were we up against? Now, we saw that T-34-85 earlier on. In the war, the Russians had designed a T-44 tank, a frying pan-shaped turret, like on this tank coming on now. Good ballistic shape to hopefully protect the crew inside. They start with a 100mm gun. That's a powerful gun. And they call it the T-54, and they make lots and lots of them. Very quickly, they do an improved model, the T-55. Now, this is where it gets a bit complex, so bear with me here. In 1956, China and Russia pal up. They do a treaty, Sino-Soviet treaty. As part of the deal, Russia gives the plans for tanks to the Chinese and tells them how to build tanks. And this is what the Chinese build. This is actually a copy of a Russian T-54. It's called a Type 59 in Chinese service. And even more confusing, that particular tank has got that British gun on because the Chinese exported it all around the world and Britain came along with its L7 105mm gun and said, well, if you want to improve your tank, buy our gun and put it on it. And that's the test vehicle that Royal Ordnance did that with. Now, the Americans, meanwhile, after World War II, yet again, they decimate their tank force. They've got one tank division left by 1950. The head of their research department says, tanks are now obsolete, we're not going to need them again, get rid of them all, and then the Korean War kicks off. And of course, then everybody wants tanks again. After the war, the Americans have been upgrading, very simple improvements, M47, M48 tanks, and then they move on to this one, the M60. It's really, they call it the Patton family of tanks. They're very similar looking, they just seem to get bigger all the time. And with the M60, they were going to build a very modern, sophisticated tank. They decided to go for this one because it was much easier to build and much simpler. So with the M60, it's got a huge cast armour turret. If you can see it from the front, it's almost got what they call a boat-shaped hull. Again, if it drives over a mine, the blast gets vented up the side and not trapped under the vehicle. And again, for that tank, guess again, it's a 105mm gun from Britain, built under licence in America. Again, all the tanks of this period, from the 1960s through the 70s, want that British gun. Now, this tank is the T-72. It was originally designed as a rival in Russia for the T-64 tank. Even though we think of communist Russia, monolithic, everything by command economy, actually the tank factories still had rivalries. T-64 is built, but it has problems. It's unreliable, not that good in many ways. So a rival factory comes up with this design for the T-72. It was supposed to be only built if the country goes to war. Somehow it was fudged and it goes into service. 125mm gun, very low profile. You look at how low that tank is, less of a target. It's an attack tank. It was designed to be used in large numbers to attack NATO in the West. How they make it so low is they get rid of the one person who has to stand up in the tank. That's the loader. Because the loader has to be able to pick up the rounds of ammunition, put them in the breech of the gun. If you haven't got him, that profile can go down, and that's what they do on the T-72. They have an auto loader. For the first time, you have a carousel. Think of the old Kodak slide projector. It's a round base that drops round. A rammer puts the breech, opens the breech, puts the round in the breech, followed by the explosive charge. And that means that the tank is lower. It also means that ammunition is vulnerable inside the turret. If you're penetrated at all, that means that ammunition can blow up quite easily. Hence what we've been seeing in the Ukraine with lots of those T-72s blowing up and the turret flying off once they've been penetrated. Now, having a look down the other end, we've got the British Challenger tank. This started life as a tank designed for the Shah of Iran. Britain was building, or hoping to build, a very sophisticated tank. MBT-80 was the project name. Meanwhile, in the background, the Shah of Iran came to Britain and said, I'm going to buy a series of tanks from you, this one of which they call it FV4030/3. Now, the Shah gets deposed in 1976, and the British Army takes over the programme of taking on this tank. There was some improvements, and it becomes the Challenger. So with this tank, for the first time, we've put our new secret armour on the tank called Chobham. It's a laminate armour. It can't be bent, and that's why Challenger 1 and then later Challenger 2 have got these flat, faceted surfaces. Challenger 1, the same gun really that was on the Chieftain tank beforehand, 120mm, very good, very accurate, but now we've got more mobility than the Chieftain generation, much more power in the back, with over 1,000 horsepower on this engine. Now, Challenger, therefore, goes into service with the British military. It sees action in the First Gulf War. But the truth is, it's not really the tank they wanted. They wanted some of the technology that was being designed for MBT-80. And that's why in the background, Vickers come along with a new tank called the Challenger 2. And they offer it to the Army, and that goes into service in the year 2000. And we're going to see the Challenger 2 with the British Army display fairly shortly. So I think that ends our little display here. We're now going to move on back to Steve for some armoured cars and armoured personnel carriers.
Thank you very much indeed to David. What a great display that was, and of course some of those vehicles you'll see later on as we continue. Time now for our armoured cars and personnel carriers display. A variety of vehicles that have been supporting tanks.
We're here live at Tankfest 2022. We've just seen the Cold War Armour display. Richard, that sounded awesome.
Yes, I was going to say the first thing that springs to mind is that display. As soon as it starts, the decibel level rises somewhat, doesn't it?
It's one of those. I don't know if it came across on the live stream, but see, when you're here, it's not merely the sound. It's fact the whole ground shakes underneath you when you're hearing that display. It's absolutely fantastic.
And a couple of favourites there. AMX, fantastic. I just love the design of the AMX, and of course, for me, it has to be right at the end there, the Challenger 1.
Yeah. Of course, if you're a World of Tanks player, you can play all of these tanks in the game as well. If you're interested in supporting the Tank Museum's work, don't forget you can check out Tiltify. The link's in the description that you'll see up against this video. If you're on Twitch, it should be in the description there as well. What we're going to do next is we're going to go on to another one of our guest videos where we've been asking tank museums around the world, if you could have brought a tank to Tankfest 22, which one would you bring? And our next guest is going to be our wonderful friends in the Saumur Tank Museum in France.
Welcome to the French Tank Museum. We are based in Saumur. Our friends at the Bovington Tank Museum asked us to present you a vehicle which could one day participate to the Tankfest. Well, what about this one? The Polar Reconnaissance Armored Vehicle, or Engin Blindé de Reconnaissance, EBR, was designed by Polar and entered service with the French Army in 1951. It is fondly remembered by the armored cavalry for its performance, its innovative character, and its longevity. The last vehicles did not come out of active service until the mid-80s. The main role of the vehicle was to carry out reconnaissance missions, collecting intelligence, and using its weapons if necessary. The EBR could expect to encounter other armored vehicles, even tanks. Therefore, it is equipped with powerful main armament, initially a 75mm gun, which was replaced by a 90mm gun from 1964. As a reconnaissance vehicle, the EBR had excellent mobility. The four wheels, located in the center, could be lowered to improve mobility on difficult terrain. On roads, these wheels were raised to gain speed. The EBR had a four-man crew. The commander and a gunner in the turret, and two drivers, one for forwards and one for reverse, in two cockpits at either end of the hull. The mobility had thus increased, as it was possible to drive as fast in reverse as forwards. The engine is located in the hull under the turret. This air-cooled V12 produced 200 horsepower, which enabled the EBR to exceed 100 km per hour or 60 miles per hour. The vehicle had a range of 650 kilometers on the road. To celebrate the 80th anniversary of the creation of the French armored cavalry, the French Tank Museum has completed the major renovation of an EBR. It now works like new. It will be presented at the French Cavalry School's annual display known as the Carousel, this year on July 13th, 15th and 16th. It will then be ready to use in demonstrations next year. We would love to welcome you to the Summer Tank Museum. Please visit our website, Instagram, and Facebook. We are open all year and we hope to see you soon. Many thanks to the Bovington Tank Museum and bon Tankfest à tous.
We're live here in Bovington in the south of England, here at Tankfest 2022. That was a video from our friends in Ssgt. It is a fantastic collection they've got there. If anyone watching this is wondering what to do in the middle of July, actually the carousel that you referred to there is a terrific display. They've got some really super things.
Beautiful, beautiful museum, and also a beautiful part of the country, of course.
Yeah, the excuse for going there is the wine growing, the horses. It's great. You can get the whole family there if you keep a straight face.
And we're going straight over to another museum now. We're going over to Austria to find out what our friends in Austria would actually bring to Tankfest.
Hello from the Austrian Military Museum in Vienna. Behind me is an M47, a pattern tank. This is the tank we love to bring to Tankfest, but it's a heavy equipment, so it's not possible right now. The patterns were produced in the early 1950s and delivered all over Europe. Almost all European nations used the M47 in the 1950s and 1960s. Italy was the main user with 3,500 tanks. Austria acquired 150 tanks from US stocks for $1 symbolic per tank. So it was really a bargain. By the way, the most famous tank driver of an M47 was Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was driver in his national service time in the Austrian army. The tank used a 90mm tank gun, and it was the first American tank with a stereoscopic rangefinder. The only problem of that tank was the engine, an 810 horsepower petrol engine, which was very, very thirsty. So in the 1960s, the engine was converted to a diesel engine, AVDS 1790, the diesel from the M60 tank. This conversion was done in Vienna, the capital of music.
Welcome back. We're here live at Tankfest 2022 here at the Tank Museum in Bovington. Now here in Bovington we have a rich and a wide variety of ways in which we display heavy armour to the general public. And Richard, presumably waltzing with tanks was an integral part of your training with
It was,
British
absolutely. Army. I think it was. No, I mean that's completely. I mean, I have to say, 10 out of 10 for style and finesse from them.
I've got to say, I wouldn't have thought of that approach myself, but hey, if it works, it works. And actually, the Franz's Museum there in Vienna looks absolutely fantastic. You've been there, haven't you?
I was fortunate enough, literally a month and a half ago, to visit the museum, and it is absolutely stunning. And I know I got a hard time off of you because I actually commented what a beautiful museum it was.
Yeah, arguably the second most beautiful tank museum in the world.
The second most beautiful tank museum in the world, but it is beautiful, absolutely stunning. I mean, I really can't stress that enough.
It's a terrific place, and actually all of the guests we've had here, we would have loved to have seen them live in person, but we'd like to say thank you to all of them for contributing what they would have brought, and hopefully next year in Tankfest, which will be at the end of June in 2023, we'll be able to see some of them actually physically here for a trip round the arena in front of a crowd of people.
I was going to say, Richard, how important is the guest armour to Tankfest just to keep it fresh, I assume?
Yeah, and one of the things we're trying to bring the subject to life. We're trying to bring things into the public realm that don't normally get seen, and we've got a great audience here. We get there normally over the weekend. We'll have somewhere just over 20,000 people coming here, and for a lot of the other museums around Europe, their audience numbers are much smaller than ours, and it's a chance for us to show the people who come here some really great stuff they might not have seen before. Some of these things actually aren't. There are no examples in the UK, but also for a chance for some of these other museums the chance to have a moment in the spotlight. Where they can see what's out there, and they can be better known.
And I know that a lot of people have asked me this recently. I know you love to keep, obviously, everything about the museum fresh, the displays, the exhibitions fresh as well. Are you allowed to share any tidbits for the future of the museum?
Yeah, well, we're constantly refreshing the exhibitions here. The people who've been coming this year would have seen our brand new Second World War exhibitions over the last couple of years. We've relayed our Second World exhibitions here, really for the first time properly in the best part of 30 years. And what we've tried to do with the Second World War displays is really tell the story of individual tank soldiers. We've been interviewing as many guys as we possibly could over the last few years. And those people now, the guys who are in their 90s, they're the people who were the teenagers in 1944. And capturing their stories has been really important. We've been showing those. Next year's display, this is a scoop for anyone who's online today. We're going to try and look actually how tanks have worked in popular culture. We're having a display for which our working title is rather imaginatively, I think, Tanks for the Memories. I've got to say, it wasn't my idea. I think that's probably David Willey. What we want to try and do with that display is try and look at how people have engaged with tanks over the course of the last 100 years. Ever since tanks began, we've seen tank toys, we've seen tank models. First World War, you could buy a tank handbag for your wife if you really wanted to shorten the length of your marriage. There was tank everything, and actually we want to try and explore how tanks have been portrayed in the media. We want to look at model making, we want to look at gaming, war games, and the whole breadth of how tanks have been displayed. So that'll be opening in Easter 2023. If you want to come and check that out at the Tank Museum, every ticket's an annual pass.
Fantastic. And Richard, I take the opportunity now, of course, to just thank you and everybody around there, because the work you do down here is extraordinary. I mean, it really is. And I do sometimes, pinch myself when we come down to events such as this, and what you can pull off is quite remarkable.
Yeah, we're a small team, but we're really passionate about what we do. Basically, we describe what we do here at the Tank Museum as we tell the story of tanks and the people who serve with them. And everything we do as a charity is geared up to that end, because these are stories of people who really matter. And it's not just stories of generals. It's not just stories of the tanks that worked. It's the story of the people who are operating the tanks. It's the story. We've got a chap interviewed in our Afghanistan display. He's interviewed with his mum. And mums of tank drivers actually don't get the attention that they deserve. And we tell the story of not just the tanks that work, we tell the story of the tanks that fail as well, the prototypes, the technology story behind it. And this is a rich subject area which over the course of the last 100 years says everything about the world. We've got fear and courage and life and death and communism and fascism and freedom and repression. This is a story of the world told through the medium of tanks.
No, it's absolutely fantastic, Richard. And I think also for me personally, I mean, of course, I did my basic training and everything down here, so the museum for me was such a lifeline. But I think for everybody in the tank regiment, of course, we are all mad keen on tanks, technology, and the mechanics behind it all. But what I think we particularly appreciate about the museum is the fact that it also does look at the human side of it, the people that actually served in them.
Yeah, and I suppose for you as a former tank soldier, when was the first time you came to Bovington?
Oh my goodness! Well, I mean, cut a very long story short. So we actually lived in Beer Regis for a couple of years. For those of you who aren't aware, Beer Regis is literally, I don't know, 5 miles away from here, 6 miles away.
Just up the road.
Yeah, just up the road. So I actually used to see. I mean, in those days, we used to see some of the tanks driving down the roads up there, which obviously inspired my interest in the first place in it. So the first time I came here, I was probably about 9 years old. I reckon something like that, actually.
We've got a long-running competition here at the museum amongst the staff about who's got the photo of them at the Tank Museum at the earliest age. And my own entry, I'm particularly chuffed with. My first photo of me here in Bovington at the Tank Museum was perched on the back of a Mark IV tank with my mum and my brother when I was 2. And it's quite a difficult entry to beat for the Tank Museum team. But you, for a member of the Royal Tank Regiment, this is your regimental museum, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And of course, when we were down here in training, we used to come across here, and it used to be, various lessons. I mean, it wasn't just the pleasure of looking at the vehicles. We had various lessons here about, obviously, the firepower and the protection and armour and spacing and the development of the tank through history and that sort of thing as well. And then further on in my career, when I served in Lulworth, which again, if you're not aware, is not far from here, down on the coast, we used to come back here to look at, the firepower side of it, the main armament and things.
And for World of Tanks, you've been coming to Tankfest for 10 years or more now. Is that what?
Well, it's the 11th year we sponsored that, yeah. So, yes, it's been absolutely fantastic. You may have noticed there, we were actually talking a bit more than usual because we were playing for a bit of time there, waiting for the next display, which is about to ready to start now. So we're going to hand back to the arena and Mr. David Willey, and this time with Staff Sergeant Chris McLaren.
Gunnery school, so he should know all about these vehicles, so I'm going to be asking him questions about them. And Staff Sergeant Chris, what's this fella?
That's the Jackal vehicle used by the Royal Armour Corps. We have 3 regiments using these right now. It's used for the light strike and the reconnaissance role.
And obviously, for all of us watching it, look like it's got camo net on the outside. That's not camouflage netting, though, is it?
No, that's the Barracuda camouflage system. Along with the days where we hide our vehicles just from the visual sighting systems, everybody around the world now is using thermal imaging. So this camouflage is specifically to hide the vehicle from thermal imaging systems.
And that's showing the heat signature, as it were?
Yep, that's there to hide you from the heat.
So what you're looking at here is a vehicle that's obviously very mobile, very fast. So when you say that word strategic, it can get to places, presumably straight up the motorway or something.
Yeah, so we call it strategic mobility. If you think you try to move a Challenger 2 to another country somewhere, it needs to be put on a ship, it needs to be put on a low loader. It takes a lot of resources, a lot of fuel. With the Jackal, it can just drive down the motorway itself and it can be there within a day.
And originally, this is what's called a UOR, Urgent Operational Requirement. The Treasury gave the Army or the Ministry of Defence a pot of money for vehicles that were, or equipment that was specially going to be needed for Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of that's been dumped. We just saw that Warthog that's no longer in service. Other bits we're keeping in service, and this is one of them.
Yeah, we recognised its capabilities in Afghanistan. We thought actually this would be a great light reconnaissance vehicle, so we brought it from the UOR fleet into the core fleet for the rest of the regiments to use.
And it's got, at the moment, 50 calibre machine gun on the top. I assume that you can change that depending on what your situation is or what you're going up against.
Yep, it can be armed to the teeth for such a light vehicle. We have the 50 cal on top. We can put a grenade machine gun on there or another GPMG. The Commander has a GPMG as well, so there's plenty of firepower there. Not to mention that it can carry Javelin and NLAW, and we know how effective those weapons are because of the recent news.
And again, this idea of the suspension, when you're going down the motorway, I'm assuming you don't need quite the cross-country ability that it's showing at the moment.
Yeah, it's got adjustable suspension, so you can either lift it all the way up if you want to go over a large obstacle, or if you're going to go down the motorway, you can drop it down. It also has a party trick where it can drop all the way down to the floor. You can collapse the roll cage in and you can fit it inside an ISO container for shipping.
Okay. So, another vehicle. Now, earlier on, we saw that Scorpion tank from the Cold War display. This is part of the same family that's actually still in service with the Army at the moment. What's this fella?
Okay, so this is your Spartan. It's the infantry carrier version of the CVRT fleet. Currently, there's no plans to replace it straight away now. We have just retired the CVRT Scimitar from Royal Armour Corps service. This will soldier on with the Royal Engineers in the role of the Royal Engineer recce teams.
And originally it was like a small armoured personnel carrier. That's the gist behind it.
Yeah, back in the 70s, you could fit 4 people in there. Not anymore, with all the kits and with all the anti-tank systems.
And again, aluminium armour. It's got a new engine. Doesn't have that old petrol engine. Cummins diesel, something like that?
Well, we went diesel quite a while ago. The Cummins diesel, nice and reliable, and it's a lot more efficient as well, so it gives it a much better range.
So this is a vehicle we're going to see around for a bit longer, but really that whole CVRT family, the whole idea that it went into service back in the 60s, a lot of armoured vehicles, you know, sometimes they have an effective long life. It's not just that we can't afford to replace them, as it were.
Yeah, so this, because we haven't got a model to replace it with just yet, we're thinking Boxer variants, or more likely it's going to be an Ajax variant.
And by the way, the L numbers, the L sticker rather, on the back of these vehicles, just remember that. Some of you live down here at Bovington. We've got Army families here today, and they're very welcome. But also those L numbers, if you're not used to driving around the roads here, that means exactly what it says. The driver's doing learner training. So do give them plenty of room, because as a Phase 2 recruits come down, they then have to learn how to drive all these vehicles, and they've got to be road legal.
Yeah, it's got to be road legal. You'll notice some wing mirrors on there as well. Clearly we don't fight wars with wing mirrors on, but it's just there to make it road legal. And bearing in mind that some of the girls and boys coming through only just learned to drive a car a couple of weeks before, and then they're straight out on the roads with a tracked vehicle, some of it pushing towards 70 tonnes in the case of Challenger.
And we tend to put rubber pads on those tracks as well, so they don't chew up the road.
Yeah, it's a NATO thing. We don't use aggressive tracks, so you'll see these pads. Just a word of warning, try to keep a distance from the vehicles. These pads can fly off, and it's quite easy to go through a windscreen.
Now, again, as the vehicle drives around, many people, you'll notice some of the different symbols on vehicles. Some of them are obvious, some less so. The little circle that'll always be on the front of a vehicle, that's got its weight on. So when it's approaching a bridge or similar, if there's someone in charge, military policeman, etc., he'll be able to see whether that bridging weight, if it's acceptable to go over the bridge.
You'll notice the sighting system that's on the Commander's cupola there. That's an older generation passive infrared sight. It's starting to show its age now. Modern vehicles have the thermals on there. That is essentially just a monocle that you might use as a dismount, but with a L37 7.60 machine gun on there.
And this idea that in the modern era, we just said it, but the idea that you look through binoculars at your enemy, nowadays most of the sighting systems are looking it through thermal or infrared. So in other words, you're seeing a heat signature on a screen rather than the actual vehicle.
Yeah, and that feeds into the next vehicle coming in there, the Warrior. The Royal Armour Corps has retired the CVRT Scimitar, and for the brigade reconnaissance role, we are now adopting the Warrior, which is a much, much bigger platform.
So FV510, this is the Warrior vehicle. Originally goes in as an armoured personnel carrier for a section of infantry. IFV nowadays, infantry fighting vehicle.
Yeah, there's a difference between an APC, an armoured personnel carrier, and an infantry fighting vehicle. Traditionally, an APC would drop the troops off a couple of kilometres away from the objective. The troops would then advance towards and then attack the position. With an infantry fighting vehicle, the idea is that it becomes its own fire team. It can fight its way onto the objective and drop the troops just a couple of metres away from it, even if they may not need to dismount because it's been destroyed already.
And the whole point of this generation, we've already seen the Challenger, Challenger 1, Challenger 2. They're much faster and more mobile tanks, so this needs to be fast enough to keep up with them. It's going to do its job properly.
And they are really quick. I mean, I know you've driven one. It is just a giant go-kart. You put it in forward and put your foot down.
And you can see automatic door. It's a powered door at the rear there. It's obviously the vehicle's got fantastic brakes. They show that off. There's a reason for that, isn't there?
I'll explain it, 'cause I'm sure he's going to pull away any second as soon as I try to speak.
Okay, so why is the door? So you were telling us earlier, 2 doors if you put 2 vehicles back to back?
Yep, you fell for his trap there. Yeah, so you see the door, hinged door, rather than something that drops down. You think of a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, there's a ramp essentially that comes down. The British use a hinged door, and the reason for this is because if you open the doors of 2 warriors and drive them back to back, it creates an armoured column or an armoured corridor between the 2 vehicles, so you can move troops and supplies under the cover of armour.
And again, the power of that engine, it speeds it around, very good brakes to stop suddenly so the dismounts can get out the back. Radon cannon, 30mm cannon in the top. That's quite a dated weapon, but still pretty effective, I imagine.
Yeah, it is dated, but we can upgrade the ammunition natures for it. It still has plenty of punch to deal with the peer adversary, which for the Warrior would be something like a BMP-2 and other reconnaissance vehicles. Luckily for us, a lot of the peer forces have quite thin armour, so 30mm is more than a match for that.
So for the infantry carrying role, this is going to be replaced probably mid-2025 by Boxer, which is going to be a wheeled vehicle built in Britain up at Telford. But you're reusing those, as you say, now for reconnaissance until Ajax, famously, fingers crossed, is ever ready.
Yeah, it does feed into our reconnaissance doctrine. We mentioned that everyone has thermal images now. We can't hide from the enemy, so therefore we need to be able to fight for the information. The best thing about the back of a Warrior, you can put in a javelin team, unlike CVRT where you couldn't carry dismount, so it fits into our aggressive reconnaissance doctrine. And although she looks similar to the vehicle that came into the service in the 1980s, it's a completely different beast. It's got thermal imaging in there, it's got a better sighting system, it's also got the combat radios in there to share data across the network. So although it's very similar to what came in service, it's been upgraded quite a few times.
And obviously one of the big contrasts you can see that's going on now, the Army really has 2 speeds, dead slow, flat out. We can't thrash our own historic tanks around this track. Yes, you can understand why. We really don't want to break them. We husband them, we look after them. It's only when you see these moderner vehicles driving around at this speed you realise the capability of some of these track vehicles, how mobile they are. Now, a couple of other UOR vehicles. This is Foxhound and Mastiff, I believe.
Certainly is. Foxhound came into service, another UOR vehicle for Afghanistan. An absolutely incredible vehicle. It takes a lot of its engineering design from the Formula One. So it's got a single-piece monocoque chassis, meaning essentially the entire hull is made from one piece of ceramic material. It's there to take blasts and direct fire. You'll also notice it's got an old suspension setup. So between the wheels you see these black bars. That is torsion bar suspension mounted outside the hull. The idea being that if the suspension went through the hull, an IED blast could cause damage inside the vehicle, so everything is mounted outside.
And again, you've got this very classic V shape, so if a mine goes off or an IED, the blast is vented up the side of the vehicle, hopefully not trapped underneath, which may flip you over, cause much more damage.
Yep, the last thing you want to do is try to contain the blast. The idea is to get the blast away from the vehicle. And we can see that well with the Mastiff behind. It's got sacrificial components on this. The wheels and the fuel tanks are designed to blow off. So if there's a large explosion under the vehicle, it ejects the fuel tanks away from the vehicle, away from the crew, so you don't have that secondary fire issues.
And again, on these vehicles, like a lot of the modern kit, you'll see these boxes on the front. ECM, electronic countermeasures equipment. Again, we could tell you now what's in there, but we'd have to kill you afterwards. And lots of little cameras around the outside of the vehicle. They must be useful when you're driving in certain situations.
Yeah, in urban operations, the future of warfare, as we've seen, is in urban operations. And with urban ops, situation awareness is critical. Having these cameras everywhere makes the commander's job much better.
Now, with the Mastiff, this is bar armour. You see these cages on a lot of modern vehicles. What's the purpose of that?
So the bar armour is there specifically for one weapon, and that's the RPG-7. It's there to fuse the RPG so it doesn't detonate, and if it does detonate, it's going to detonate away from the hull. It gives the vehicle a lot better protection. And it's an incredibly efficient way of dealing with it. If you think an RPG-7 can go through 300 millimetres of armour, that's tons and tons of steel. We can negate that RPG system by just having some half a ton's worth of bar armour.
And again, looking at these, obviously a lot of the fleet that was used out in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's come back to the UK, it's still in these sandy colours. Slowly these are now being changed, aren't they, and actually painted as if they're going to be used back to the old NATO, Northwest Europe type schemes, etc.
Yeah, I think the answer is pretty obvious why we're doing that. It was more of a shift now away from the counterinsurgency back into the high-intensity warfare that we all know and love.
So with that, obviously at the moment, you're very interested in some of the future developments of armour. Would you say the Army's got suddenly very much more interested in tanks again?
Yeah, we certainly have. I think it was a legacy left over from the counterinsurgency campaigns. I think we took our foot off the gas a little bit, thinking that we're reaping the benefits of peace. But actually, we've seen that's not the case, and we're now hurtling into something which we were now prepared for, thankfully.
And Chris, just to make the point here, we are a teaching establishment. This museum collection was put together to teach soldiers, and we still do that. This T-72 tank over the back there, Chris has been using that tank to teach serving soldiers about threat vehicles, as they're called. What does a T-72, what's it look like? What are its capabilities? And looking at our own equipment very much with the view, how can we defeat those bits of kit should we ever come up against them?
And it's quite an easy lesson to teach. You'd be surprised at how much appetite there is out there across the Royal Armour Corps and across defence as a whole of knowing this information. People join the Army because they're interested in this stuff. So days like this, coming to the Tank Museum and using the equipment is a really good, very easy sell.
And just simple things like recognition, you know, what is that vehicle? What's it look like through your thermal imaging? What's it look like in reality? And one of the other areas we've been encouraging soldiers, and lots of the kids out there I know at the moment, make a model of something, you'll remember it, you'll remember the bin, you'll remember the wheel stations, etc. So actually the Army's got some modelling clubs going. I know there's one down at Lulworth, and you end up with that model you can show everyone afterwards for recognition purposes.
Driving it like you stole it.
Right, so this is Titan, I believe. This is the Army's current bridge layer.
Yep, it's a armoured vehicle launch bridge. It's based on the Challenger 2 chassis with a slight modification. If you look at the rear of the vehicle, you'll see some fans there rather than being on the back decks. Being a Challenger 2 chassis, it means that it can take the punishment that Challenger 2 can. So when new armour comes out for Challenger 2, we can just modify it slightly and attach it to this vehicle.
And that bridge, we're going to see it deploy in a moment in the little section attack. How long's that bridge?
26 metres, but it comes with lots of other types of bridge. So that's a Type 12 or a number 12 bridge. It comes with a number 10, which can do 30.5 metres. It's quite fast deploying as bridges go. It can be deployed in just under 2 minutes, which is pretty quick, but obviously it's important to get it in there quick.
Now, there's never enough bridge laying or engineering assets in any military force, so I imagine this is one of those bits of kit you really have to protect and keep that asset safe all the time.
Yeah, every tank commander gets given a target priority list. That's the number one thing that you need to kill first. And at the top of every country's target priority list is the bridging assets. If you can kill the bridges, you can constrain where the enemy can manoeuvre to within rivers.
And if you watch later on, when that T-72 comes out again, the Soviet forces knew they'd never have enough bridging material, so they made some of their vehicles to float, which made them fairly thin, lightweight vehicles, or, like that T-72 tank, stuck on the side of the turret is a tube. That's a snorkel, so it could actually drive under a riverbed by extending the snorkel out. So that was, they knew we'd blow up all the bridges in Europe if they attacked. Now, these bridge units, these Titans, they're actually crewed by Royal Engineers.
Yeah, the Royal Engineers operate this, the Trojan, Titan and Terrier. The arm sen that we're in now isn't just for the Armour Corps, the Royal Armour Corps. We have engineers, we have logistics here, we have artillery, so it's a mix of everybody. So, yeah, you see all these different vehicles, these not all Royal Armour Corps personnel.
Okay, well, that bridge layer is quite a bit of kit. Again, do we actually know at the moment how many of these we've got left in service? I'm putting you on the spot here. I don't think we didn't rehearse this one, sorry.
We don't rehearse anyway, it's not a problem.
No, that's right.
We originally purchased around about 48 of Trojan and Titan, but they're incredibly effective. We've got lots of spare bridges for them. So the idea is that you can't just have one bridge layer per bridge. Behind that, on operations, we'll have 5 or 6 trucks with lots of different bridges on there, which can then reload and then continue crossing.
And I keep repeating this point, but it's really important to get across because we've seen this failure in the Ukraine. Some of those Russian forces, you need not just all arms. In other words, you need the infantry, you need your tanks, you need your engineer assets, you need your resupply. They've got to keep up with each other. And obviously that's failed in the Ukraine, where we've got tanks on their own from the Russian forces, lacking the logistics and the support to keep them going. And that's why this is based on the Challenger hull, so it can keep up the same speed as where the tanks are getting to. Now, as he puts that smoke, it's not that he's got problems with his engine. He's doing that on purpose. This is putting diesel onto the hot exhaust.
Yep, so it's got the same engine exhaust system as a Challenger 2. So what it does, it pumps, it's essentially a small injector from the engine just next to the turbocharger. So when you turn the pump on, it just produces a huge amount of smoke. Now that's really relevant for the engineers. You think that it's going to go into a river crossing. The enemy want to kill this as target priority number 1. It needs to be able to screen itself. So not only using its smoke grenade dischargers, which we'll come on to in a minute, but also using that engine screen system to hide itself from the enemy.
So if you are asthmatic, watch it. We're going to see an awful lot of that smoke coming your way over the next 10 or so minutes, especially from beasts like this fellow. So coming on now, Challenger 2, but with all the bells and whistles on. This is what they call theatre entry standard. So anything that might be added to a Challenger is pretty much on this one.
Yeah, we can see the Barracuda thermal cam on there as well. We brought this out in Iraq quite a while ago, and it wasn't because it was trying to screen us from thermal cameras, because it keeps the temperature down inside the vehicle, which was a godsend when it's 50 degrees outside.
So obviously a powerful 120mm gun, hunter-killer system. Can you tell us what that does?
So the hunter-killer system is based around independent commander sights and gunner sight. What that means is the gunner can be engaging one target while the commander is queuing up another target. So once the gunner fires his shot and destroys target number 1, the commander is already lined up, lased and tracking target number 2. He presses a button, the turret will go around, and he can engage that target quickly. That feeds into the British defence doctrine of we know we're always going to be outnumbered on the battlefield, so we need to be able to outpunch, outreach, and outspeed of engagement all the other enemy.
And if you look at this vehicle, as I said, it's got all the bells and whistles on. Remote weapon station just above the gunner's position there, the other side from the commander. And on the side of the vehicle, the extra armour that is put on. When you see the Challengers training, they're like the one we've got over in front of the Conservation Centre. They don't have that extra armour put on until it's really needed in a combat situation. And that really is just an aid to training, etc. I think he's getting bored.
Randomly beeping his horn there.
On the back of the turret, the table, it's not for tea or anything. This, what looked like a little tabletop arrangement, various bits of electronic countermeasures.
We do use it for drinking tea, though.
Okay, so that's the bit behind the commander's cupola there. Again, a lot of vehicles. You'll see again the boxes on the front because of what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. countermeasures equipment. Again, all still pretty much classified. Smoke discharges on the front. And above that barrel, that's the main gunner's sight, isn't it?
Yep, so above the barrel we have the TOG sight, it's the thermal sight. Put above the barrel. And just in front of the commander, that sight there is the commander's sight. That's the 360 degree sight. And below that sight we have the gunner's sight.
And again, when this tank was being designed, it was still that era of the Cold War. We knew where the enemy were. They were the other side. That's why the armour was all on the front of the vehicle. Now, of course, with the idea of counterinsurgency, urban operations, we see in the Ukraine top attack, this idea of having to put armour all around the vehicle now.
Yeah, we're now seeing that the future of warfare is going to be fighting in the cities, and therefore you cannot just assume the enemy is going to be to your front. You have to have a full 360 protection. Now, we're fortunate with Challenger, it's always designed to have applique add-on armour running down the side of the vehicle. We see other countries around the world struggling to modify their vehicles to have that level of protection, but it's something that Britain does very well with its vehicles.
And that's one of the things that gives crews confidence, because what is this very clever invention, Chobham armour? Again, you can try and look it up on the internet. What's actually in there is still officially a secret, but it has genuinely tremendous stopping power, doesn't it? We haven't lost guys from enemy fire. It's been blue on blue in a Challenger. Yep,
it is world-leading protection. Challenger 2 is, in my opinion, the best physically protected tank in the world, just because of that excellent armour technology.
And we're about to go forward now with Challenger 2 onto a new model, Challenger 3. You've been following that new gun?
New gun, the L55 A1 made by Rheinmetall, by far the best tank gun in the world today. And because it's smoothbore, because it's got commonality of NATO standard ammunition, we can shop around the world. We can buy American, French, German ammunition, which suits us. It also suits our pockets a lot cheaper. So it's an excellent upgrade.
And these things, so in other words, the British Army is not going away from the tank. One of the other things these tanks are going to have in the future, soft kill and hard kill defensive aid suites, things that are going to help protect the tank that we're seeing going on at the moment in Ukraine, the idea of top attack, warning the crews when we're going to be actually, if we're being lasered or if something's coming our way. We'll wait till
Just going to wait for him to stop. Yeah, the active protection systems are an absolute game changer for armoured warfare. For the last 30, 40 years, people have been saying the tank's dead. It's, when anti-tank guided missiles emerged, they said that's the end of the tank. Again, we saw that armour technology came there and negated that risk. And now we're saying that, well, because of UAVs and because of modern anti-tank systems, tanks are dead. Well, active protection systems will again negate that risk and then make the primary weapon on the battlefield back to being the tank.
Okay, now Chris has got to disappear off now. I'm just reminding you of that. He's got to run all the way off there, go all the way up the wall, and we'll see him trying to leg it up the top of the tower for the next part of our display. So if you want to start heading that way, and I'll finish off on the last vehicle that's about to come on, which is the Krav.
Are you going to be okay doing this without me?
Yeah, I'm fine. You can go now. And the Krav, this is another version built on the Challenger family. Yeah, give him a round of applause. He's done very well there. Bit of fitness training, I think, is needed. So the Krav coming on now, another one of those really important vehicles to keep an armoured force going. So Krav Challenger repair an armoured recovery vehicle. So you've got a dozer blade on the front, that'll help manoeuvre things out the way. It can also dig into the ground, so it can use that winch. You can see the cables on the front, 100-ton pull. So if you've got a tank broken down or stuck somewhere, you can recover it so it can fight again another day. Really important. On the back is an Atlas crane that can lift up a whole Challenger pack. So the engine and the gearbox for a Challenger tank. It can tow a trailer behind that carries spare engines in as well. And it's crewed by REME, Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers. These are the guys that can fix things in the field. So on this vehicle as well, it's almost like a mobile workshop for the Army as it goes around the place. And again, because this is the one that's based up the road, if you look at the flag on it, ATDU, Army Trials and Development Unit. They keep an example of everything up there. And if there's anything new added to a vehicle, they're the guys that trial it. And as vehicles, big heavy vehicles like this are in service long periods of time. So one of those issues is, of course, they have upgrades, new technology, new things come along, they're added to the vehicles. And part of that task of ATD is just making sure when it is added, it doesn't interfere with something else. We don't deploy the blade and find we've got another bit of kit that's interfered with that. And as you can see, it's got that wrap too. It's add-on passive armour down the sides. It's got bar armour at the back because, again, all the British Army are very conscious, that idea. It's not just, as in the Cold War, we knew where the enemy were. Now the enemy might be all around you. And again, this latest phase that we're talking about all the time, tanks had the thickest armour on the front, which is why we have top attack weapons. They're coming in now from above where the armour tends to be the thinnest. We've got to find ways of dealing with that. And that's why we're talking about hard kill, soft kill, defensive aid suites. Hard kill, they fire things out to disrupt incoming rounds, so they physically stop them or disrupt them. Soft kill, you fire a pulse of electricity, and that should disrupt something like a missile with its electronics in it. All these new developments that are going to help see the tank carry on in service into the future.
What a fantastic display there, live here at Tankfest of current British Army equipment. Bovington, of course, is traditionally the home of the tank. The British Army moved its armoured vehicles here in October 1916, and the base here still does what it was set up to do over 100 years ago. As I say, we're here live at Tankfest 2022. Throughout the day, we'll give you the chance to support the Tank Museum. If you're interested in supporting us, then do check out the links in the description on this video where you can support us through Tiltify. You can leave your tips on YouTube as well through the Super Chat.
And also for Twitch, don't forget, of course, to keep an eye on the drops there and also go onto the portal to look at that mega sale.
Now, earlier, we've been exploring the Tankfest site. Richard's been all over Tankfest over the course of the day in the last couple of days. Tankfest is a 3-day event nowadays. And having explored all the different corners, he's also had the chance to catch up with the British Army section. They have their own part of Tankfest where they allow people to climb on the vehicles, meet the soldiers. And Richard has been catching up with an old Army buddy.
Yeah, and I think only a bit of an explanation for this meetup is concerned. For us, of course, Tankfest is where you do, it's like a bit of a regimental reunion, to be honest. You bump into a lot of people. Now, the chap we're going to talk to is Rich Jones. I like the VT2, the talking. But Rich, the transition when you leave the armed forces and go into Civvy Street, we call it, to become a civilian, can be, it's complicated for some people, to say the very least. And Rich's journey perhaps was a little more complicated than most. He left the British Army and unfortunately got involved in organised crime, which resulted in quite a lengthy prison sentence. He's now an author, wrote a fantastic book which he talks about on the VT, and importantly has now become a veteran support worker. So he helps people to avoid the situation that he found himself in. So an incredible chap, but now we'll go straight across and hear from Rich Jones. As a regimental museum next door to an army camp, the links between the British Army and the Tank Museum are extremely strong. Also, I find that every time I come down to Tankfest, it becomes a bit of a regimental reunion. And today is no different. And I've just bumped into a chap that I haven't seen for many, many years. And we actually served together in the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment. It's Rich Jones, author and also veteran support worker. Rich, how's your Tankfest going?
First time down, Rich, it's really good. The weather's held out. I was invited down to do a couple of days of speaking about my journey, coming out of the forces and into crime and such like, and my journey through prison life and how I'm supporting veterans. So it's going well, going really well.
I say veteran support worker, Rich. Can you explain that a bit more? What is it you do now?
Yeah, sure. So when I was put in custody for my 15-year sentence, I focused on looking at veterans in custody and the problems that they face. And I realised that there's very little done for us when we come out of the forces in relation to transition. So I created an intervention programme called Project TLS, which I now deliver in prisons and veterans in custody, where I'd also take that into bases. I'm looking at creating an awareness for people when they come out of the forces about the problems that we face when we come out of the Army and the RAF and maybe the Navy as well.
So does it bring it all back to you, Rich, when you're down here at Tankfest? I mean, as we were talking before walking down here, the smells, the sights, the sounds?
And the dust. Yeah, it's just unreal. The thing that hits me the most is not so much outside, because you can't really smell the wagons, but going into the hangar. I walked into the hangar to look at all of the archives of the different vehicles there, and immediately hit by the feisty smell of cam nets, rubber, oil, diesel, paint, and everything else that you could possibly smell. And I thought, that's back in the hangar. Straight away, nostalgia. Immediately, I was taken back to the tank park in Hamer or Fally. It was great, but it was horrible at the same time.
So how many years has it you actually served for them, Rich?
I did just over 7 years. So I left in '95. So I've been out a long time now.
And, I mean, for you, when you were in the British Army, and obviously things went a bit, should we say, awry, amiss afterwards?
Yeah, I could say my transition didn't go to plan, is the best way. Yeah, I got involved in organised crime quite heavily, and I received a 15-year sentence for my offences. And to that point, I spent 7.5 years in custody, about the same amount of time I spent in the Army. So both very profound, life-changing experiences, but I found that I've taken the positives from prison, and I've used that to sort of support veterans when I'm coming out now.
And, I mean, I've read the book, Rich. It's absolutely fantastic, may I say. For you, when you, I mean, the first time it crossed your mind about writing a book, I mean, what was the purpose of writing the book? Was it a bit almost cathartic for you to get it out of your system or something, or?
Yeah, exactly that. Initially, it was about a journey of understanding where I've been, and, let's say, that healing, cathartic process of getting it on paper, and then translate that into print to maybe support veterans. Because it is, from my perspective as someone who's served in the forces, it's not just glamorising the crime, it's understanding the mental health decline, the problems you get, the stress-related anxiety, and the fact that being involved in organised crime is not a glamorous lifestyle, and it is very damaging.
So, going back to Army life then, Rich, I mean, if you could pick, I don't know, let's say 3 things that you loved most about your time in the Army, what would that be?
Driving one of these, gunning one of these, and going on leave.
And what was the worst thing?
Stagging on, hands down. Easy day, standing on a gate with someone that doesn't know how to talk. Worst 2 hours of my life, mate.
And what would you say? I mean, you talk about when you were in prison, obviously, on the rest of it.
Yeah.
So what was it make you want to go in and help people? Was there no help for you at all when you were in prison, or?
The help's there, but it's not identified enough, and I'm trying to raise awareness of veterans in custody, because although there is support service there, a lot of us shouldn't have been in prison due to mental health. So if we can understand our transition more, we can support people coming out of the forces and hopefully reduce that offending rate.
And I'll say that sound takes you back, doesn't it?
Yeah, that one does. A Charlie doing a clunk, and he's doing his track discipline and sort his wagon out. That one, he's a bit squeaky.
Rich, thank you so much for spending a bit of time with us. I was just going to say, final point then, why should people come down to Tankfest?
It's amazing. First time here, and they've got everything going on. They've got airsoft, they've got tanks, they've got parachuters, great food, great approach, loads of enthusiasts. There's everything here, something for everyone. It's a great day. It's brilliant.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Trish, and have a great weekend.
You're welcome, mate.
We're here live at Tankfest 2022. An amazing story that Rich has there. I think it's also great to emphasise the fact that here at the Tank Museum, it's not just about kind of cool machines and things like that. This is a museum about warfare and the people who engage with it. And it's they're always good news stories. And I know Wargaming does an awful lot of work with another charity called War Child, don't they?
Yes, of course. They're about children, you know, being affected by everything. Obviously, very pertinent at the moment, in particular, everything affected by wartime. But yeah, for Rich, it's the journey, obviously, for him was not an easy one. I would give a shout out for his book. It's called Charlie 4 Kilo, which is a bit of a giveaway as to what his convictions were about, perhaps. But it is a very honest story, not only about, you know, what happened to him, but about the effects it had on relationships and further family and everything else. So, you know, a lot of kudos for Rich for being very honest and open about that. And of course, you know, what he's doing now to help veterans that have been, you know, in the position that he was in not so long ago.
Yeah, and here at the Tank Museum, we're a registered charity as well. So if you want to support the Tank Museum, sorry, there's a few explosions going on in the background there. It's quite a regular occurrence at Tankfest. I think World War III might be about to break out behind us. I think the British Army are going to dispatch some baddies fairly shortly. But yeah, if you want to support the Tank Museum, please check out the link for Tiltify that you'll see in the description on this video.
And I think we're about to go across. We're going to go to our final museum, and we're going to go across to Finland to have a look at what vehicle they would have loved to have brought to Tankfest.
Hello everybody and greetings from Finland. My name is Simo Hautala. I'm the director of the Parola Armour Museum. The museum, which locates conveniently only 1 hour drive from capital city of Helsinki, has an extensive collection of tanks, anti-tank weapons and other museum items, not to forget one of the largest armoured trains in the world. We have on display, for example, Renault FT model 1917, as well as plenty of Russian and German origin weapons. Our speciality is a large collection of Sturmgeschütz assault guns. The Parola Armour Museum, like other tank museums, has of course some very rare armoured vehicles in collection. One of those is an iconic T-34 tank. This particular tank was manufactured at Kharkov locomotive factory in 1941. Once captured by Finns in Karelia, the tank received registration number 231-1. The tank was then operated throughout the war and also took part in the summer 1944 defensive battles. On June 1944, the tank dropped into Saimaa Canal on the Karelian Isthmus after a bridge came in under it. It took 3 weeks to tow up the vehicle from the canal basin and move it to the armour centre for repair. Finally, the tank took part in the military operations in northern Finland against the Germans in the autumn of 1944. After the wartime, 231-1 was operated by the armoured regiment in Parola until 1960 and was transferred to Parola Armour Museum in 1961. It has appeared on several Finnish war films, for example Tali Ihantala from 2007 and The Unknown Soldier filmed in 2017. This tank is perhaps not as famous as the Sherman tank Fury. Nevertheless, it would be nice to see this old lady rocking in front of the huge Tankfest audience. But in the meantime, please follow us on www.panssarimuseo.fi and other social networks.
Welcome back. We're here live at Tankfest 2022 here in Bovington in the south of England. I've got to say that Parola Tank Museum in Finland is terrific. We've worked with them for a long time. There's only one T-34-76 in the United Kingdom. It actually belongs to them and is on display here at the Tank Museum. It's one of the oldest T-34s in the world. It's an absolute peach. But you've been there before, haven't you?
We've been there a couple of times now, and yeah, fantastic museum. I have to say, it's the place where my interest in armoured trains was actually born. So it's the first time I saw an armoured train. You see, at the moment, we're joining that very shortly. There's a bit of a battle going on in the background there. But yeah, the museum is fantastic. The first time we went, unfortunately, it was in the winter, and we didn't really appreciate how cold it gets in Finland in the winter.
Chilly in that part of the world.
It was a tad chilly.
But we work very closely with a lot of the museums that we've seen throughout today. We've got a network of tank museums across the world called TankNet. We get together every year and we exchange notes about how to look after the collections. We talk about loans, we talk about who's looking for what, we talk about trying to arrange exchanges. It's a tremendous network, and they've been really helpful for us here at Tankfest in 2022.
And we're now going to go across with our final look around Tankfest, and this time I went to the VCC, the Vehicle Conservation Centre, and met up with a very special guest. Here at Tankfest, we have visitors from all over the globe, and a lot of these visitors come to see perhaps what you would call the more obscure, the less well-known vehicles. And in particular, you'll find them here at Tankfest, where we are at the moment, in the VCC, or the Vehicle Conservation Centre. Now, one of those visitors that's come a long way, in fact, all the way from the USA, from the very well-known YouTube channel, The History Guy, is the man himself, Lance Geiger. Lance, firstly, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
First time at Tankfest?
First time at Tankfest. I've been to the Tank Museum several times, but the first time for the real event where they're going in circles, yeah.
And I know it's early days, but of course, how are you finding your Tankfest experience?
I haven't gotten to see everything I want to see, but I mean, this is the most fun that you can have. I don't know why anybody else would be going to whatever, the Glastonbury Festival or any of that. This is the place in the UK to have fun.
And, I mean, what do you think the appeal is? I mean, in particular, obviously, we're talking about tanks, but what's the appeal with people with tanks? Why would it sort of capture people's imagination?
War, no matter what you say about it, I mean, it's horrible, but it's also dramatic. It's central point of history. It's turning points in history, and armored warfare is part of that. So, I mean, tanks are just cool. They're amazing pieces of machinery. They're amazing engineering, but they're just something exciting about this big piece that we would put the effort into building something like this. And the armored warfare, history of armored warfare is just very interesting, and the Tank Museum is great because it's got so many rare pieces that really show you how armored warfare developed over time. And I don't know any place else in the world that would have so many sort of unique, one-off prototypes and all the sorts of things they have here at the Tank Museum.
Now the channel, I mean, you're obviously very well known for you reach out and sort of like, the more obscure, perhaps less well-known facts of history.
Tales of forgotten history.
I've always been, how on earth do you, find the information, do the research? I mean, where do you find all this from?
We find it in lots of different places. We've got a lot of advice from viewers, but I mean, you just get good at it. We've got 2 days to produce a 15-minute video. We put up 3 a week, so it takes me 2 days. If it takes me more than 2 days, I don't get Saturday off. And so you just get good at finding something strange and then turning that into a story and then turning that around into a video, and the next day you're on to another video.
Is there any particular moments of history, anything perhaps you covered or even not covered, that you've really found, oh my word, this is...
I can't pick favorites. We've done so many. One day we're talking about the Second World War, the next day we're talking about the history of peanuts. And so I love it all. It's really, and that's why I do what I do. I love the sort of channel where we can talk about something different every other day, and it all blends into this big story of forgotten history.
And why do you think, I mean, what's so important for people about history? I mean, why do you think personally that history should not be forgotten?
Oh, absolutely. You cannot possibly understand what's going on today if you don't understand the past. And one of the lessons that I get from history is bad. Every time you think something's bad, whenever you're living, you're like, oh, things are horrible. You always, if you look back, things were way worse before. We lived through it. So one of the reasons to learn history is just to say that we know that we will, no matter what's going on, whether it's COVID or the economy or the war or whatever's going on, we'll get through this because we always have. And that's a good reason to study history.
Now, YouTuber, I mean, could you have seen a few years ago that you would now be this very famous...
I had no idea. When I started making videos in the basement with me and 3 cats in a room, I had no idea it would grow to be the size that it is. It's the best job I ever had.
And what advice could you offer for anybody that's thinking about doing this?
Yeah, if you want to do YouTube or social media for a living, it's a real job. If you're young, you think everybody does that. If you're old, you think nobody does that. And what I can say is if you treat it like a job, and you take it seriously, you make good stuff, and you post that on a regular basis, you really can find a living doing what you love to do, and that's worked out for me.
And final question, why should people come and visit us here at Tankfest?
Oh, absolutely, to see the tanks. There's no better reason than that, right? You will not find a better tank collection anywhere in the world. You have a chance to see things that really aren't anywhere else, and Tankfest gives you a better chance to be able to see those than any other time of the year. So why would you not come to Tankfest?
Brilliant. Lance, thank you so much for your time, and have a fantastic time at Tankfest.
I will, you too.
Well, we're coming towards the end of our broadcast today, live at Tankfest 2022. It's been a great show. The Vehicle Conservation Centre, we don't normally open the floor up to the public. This is one of the few times we do it. It's actually one of the best rooms of military stuff anywhere in the world.
VCC, hot favourite of mine. I take the opportunity now, of course, to thank everybody involved in this, in particular Richard and his team, all the hard work they've done. It has been absolutely brilliant.
And likewise for me, there's a lot of people involved in making Tankfest work. World of Tanks has sponsored us for a number of years now. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. We've got a great volunteer team who work ever so hard over not just days, but weeks and months before getting this ready. The Tank Museum team throw everything into this. It doesn't matter what role you do at the Tank Museum, you're doing something at Tankfest that you wouldn't normally do. We've got guest vehicle owners who've helped us out. And of course, the visitors who've come here for today have come from all over the world. I was speaking to someone this morning from Ecuador. Yesterday I bumped into a guy from Sydney, lots of Americans here. It's a hugely international event. It's great to see so many people back here this year. Don't forget that tickets for next year go on sale tomorrow.
And a massive thank you, of course, to all of our players watching on whether it was Twitch or the Tank Museum's live stream. Stick around on the Twitch because we'll actually be raiding a streamer straight after this.
The only thing left really is now to say goodbye from Richard. It's a goodbye from me. Thank you for watching Tankfest live in 2022 this year from Bovington, the home of the tank. And we hope that we'll see you here next year for Tankfest 2023.